When the Great Crusade was young, and humanity's dream of galactic unity seemed within grasp, long before the Horus heresy would tear the Imperium asunder, a threat emerged from the galactic north that would forever change the course of human expansion. The Rangdan Xenocides remained shrouded in mystery even to the most learned scholars of the 41st millennium. But what fragments of knowledge survive paint a picture of xenos who achieved mastery over biological warfare and neural domination when the Emperor's forces were at their most confident. In the early decades of the 30th millennium, the Great Crusade represented the apex of human achievement. 18 Space Marine legions, each numbering over 100,000 warriors, swept across the galaxy with unstoppable momentum. Behind them marched billions of Imperial army soldiers, supported by the technological marvels of the Mechanicum, and guided by the psychic network of sanctioned astropaths. World after world fell to compliance, and humanity's expansion seemed limited only by the speed at which their fleets could traverse the void. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a civilization drunk on its own success. Imperial records speak of conquest rates that modern strategists consider impossible, with entire sectors brought into compliance within standard years. The Emperor's vision of a unified galaxy ruled by reason and science appeared not just achievable but inevitable. Fragmentary accounts describe a time when Space Marines walked as liberators rather than angels of death, when Imperial governors spoke of peaceful integration rather than brutal subjugation. Yet even at the height of this golden age, subtle anomalies began to appear in the northern reaches of the galaxy. Astropathic communications from frontier worlds carried undertones that senior telepaths described as alien harmonics, patterns of thought that seemed to echo with frequencies unknown to human consciousness. Expeditionary fleets reported longer than expected delays in bringing systems to compliance, though their dispatches attributed these setbacks to standard xenos resistance or difficult stellar cartography. The northern galactic regions had always presented unique challenges to Imperial expansion. Unlike the densely populated core worlds or the resource-rich systems of the galactic east, the north was characterized by sparse stellar populations and vast, empty spaces between inhabited systems. What worlds existed there often harbored strange ecosystems that defied easy categorization, with biological diversity that seemed to shift and adapt with unnatural speed. Imperial xenobiologists noted that northern worlds frequently contained life forms that appeared to share genetic markers across impossible distances, as if shaped by some unifying intelligence. More troubling were the reports of behavioral anomalies among Imperial personnel returning from northern deployments. Medical examinations revealed nothing physically wrong with these soldiers and officers, yet their colleagues noted subtle changes in demeanor and judgment. Some displayed an unusual interest in biological specimens from their campaigns, requesting permission to maintain private collections of alien flora and fauna. Others showed remarkable insights into xenos psychology, predicting alien tactical responses with uncanny accuracy. The Divisio Biologists initially dismissed these observations as natural adaptation to extended exposure to alien environments. The true scope of what lurked in the galactic north would not become apparent until the 920 of the 30th millennium, when the pattern of disappearances and anomalies coalesced into recognition of a coordinated threat. By then, however, the damage had already been done. The enemy they would come to know as the Rangdan had been patient, methodical, and utterly alien in their approach to warfare. Where humanity conquered through force of arms and technological superiority, the Rangdan conquered through infiltration, assimilation, and the slow corruption of their enemy's very nature. What made the Rangdan truly terrifying was not their military might, though that would prove considerable, but their understanding of biological systems as weapons of war. They viewed living beings not as individuals with inherent worth, but as components in vast biological machines that could be reprogrammed, modified, and redirected according to their needs. Human concepts of identity, loyalty, and free will were irrelevant to creatures who saw consciousness itself as merely another biological function to be manipulated. The wars that would follow would consume entire Space Marine legions, require the personal intervention of the Emperor himself, and ultimately lead to the employment of weapons so terrible that their very existence would be struck from Imperial records. The Rangdan Xenocides would prove that even in humanity's golden age, there existed threats so profound that victory could only be achieved by abandoning the very principles that made victory worth pursuing. In the grim darkness of the far future, When scholars speak in hushed tones of the lost golden age of the Great Crusade, they rarely mention that even then, humanity was forced to make choices that would haunt them for 10,000 years. The Rangdan Xenocides stand as testament to a fundamental truth about the galaxy, that sometimes the greatest threats are not those that seek to destroy humanity, but those that seek to transform it into something unrecognizable. The fragments of knowledge that survive speak of 3 separate wars, each more desperate than the last, fought against an enemy that turned humanity's greatest strengths into devastating weaknesses. They tell of space marines who turned their weapons against their own battle brothers, of worlds that had to be destroyed to prevent their populations from spreading like a plague across the stars, and of decisions made in the highest echelons of Imperial command that would echo through the millennia in ways their architects never intended. What follows is the complete account of humanity's forgotten victory and its most terrible precedent, reconstructed from classified archives, archaeological evidence, and the testimony of those few who survived to carry the burden of memory. It is the story of how the Imperium learned that in a galaxy filled with horrors, the most dangerous enemy of all might be the one that offers to make you stronger. The Galactic North during the early decades of the Great Crusade presented a deceptive facade of manageable challenges that masked the growing storm beneath. Between the years 890.M30 and 920 M30, Imperial expansion had reached a velocity that even the most optimistic projections had not anticipated. Compliance fleets moved through the galaxy at an unprecedented pace, bringing an average of 47 worlds per standard year into the Imperial fold across all expansion vectors. Yet, in the northern sectors, this rate began to show subtle but measurable deviations from expected patterns. Archaeological records from the period reveal that the northern galactic regions were characterized by unusual stellar formations and gravitational anomalies that had shaped the development of local civilizations in unexpected ways. Unlike the south, where human colonies had evolved along predictable technological paths, or the eastern spiral arms where alien civilizations followed comprehensible patterns of development, the north harbored worlds where the boundaries between different forms of life seemed unusually fluid. Planetary surveys from the 890 describe ecosystems where plant and animal life appeared to share characteristics in ways that violated standard biological classification systems. The environmental conditions that would later prove so advantageous to Rangdan expansion were already manifest during this early period, though Imperial xenobiologists interpreted them as fascinating academic curiosities rather than warning signs. Northern worlds frequently exhibited what expedition reports termed adaptive ecosystems, biospheres that seemed capable of rapid evolutionary responses to environmental changes. On the world of Gyros Thravian, for example, Imperial surveyors documented over 300 distinct species that had developed identical sensory organs, despite having no apparent evolutionary relationship. Similar patterns appeared on dozens of other worlds, creating a region where biological adaptation occurred at rates that challenged fundamental assumptions about natural selection. The warp itself behaved differently in the northern sectors, though these anomalies were initially attributed to the region's relatively sparse stellar density. Astropaths reported that psychic communication across northern systems carried what they described as biological undertones, subtle harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate with living tissue rather than pure consciousness. Navigator houses noted that warp currents in the north followed patterns that seemed almost organic in nature, flowing and shifting like the circulation systems of vast living creatures rather than following the more predictable gravitational influences found elsewhere in the galaxy. Imperial expansion doctrine of the period emphasized rapid conquest and efficient resource extraction, creating supply lines that became increasingly stretched as fleets pushed deeper into unexplored territory. The northern sectors, with their sparse population and unusual worlds, represented a particular challenge for Imperial logisticians. Standard resupply protocols assumed predictable travel times and reliable communication networks, but the North's gravitational anomalies and warp irregularities created delays that compound exponentially with distance from established bases. By 905.M30 pattern analysis, conducted by the Administratum, revealed that northern expansion was proceeding at approximately 63% of the expected rate, despite the deployment of additional resources and personnel. Initial explanations focused on the region's challenging stellar cartography and the time required to properly catalog the unusual biological phenomena encountered on northern worlds. Military strategists noted that xenos resistance in the north, while not particularly sophisticated, seemed unusually coordinated across systems that had no apparent means of communication. The growing frequency of communication delays and equipment failures in northern sectors began to generate concern among senior Imperial commanders. By 910.M30, astropathic messages from frontier worlds increasingly arrived corrupted or incomplete, with telepaths reporting difficulty maintaining clear psychic links across the region. Mechanicum adepts noted that machine spirits in northern deployments seemed prone to unusual malfunctions, exhibiting behaviors that suggested external interference rather than standard mechanical failure. More troubling were the behavioral reports emerging from Imperial Army regiments and Space Marine companies returning from northern campaigns. Medical examinations consistently showed these personnel to be in excellent physical condition, often displaying improved reflexes and enhanced pattern recognition abilities. However, their commanding officers noted subtle changes in tactical thinking and strategic priorities. Veterans of northern campaigns showed unusual interest in biological warfare techniques and displayed remarkable insights into xenos psychology that seemed to exceed their actual combat experience. The statistical data from this period, when analyzed with the benefit of hindsight, reveals a clear pattern of systematic preparation that went unrecognized at the time. Communication disruptions followed geographic patterns that suggested deliberate interference rather than random technical failures. Equipment malfunctions clustered around specific types of detection and monitoring devices, particularly those used for biological and genetic analysis. Personnel returning from northern deployments showed consistent patterns of behavioral modification that were so subtle they fell within normal ranges of individual variation. By 915.M30, the rate of unexplained incidents in northern sectors had increased by over 400% compared to the galactic average. Yet individual events remained minor enough to avoid triggering major security protocols. The genius of this approach would only become apparent later, when Imperial analysts realized that the enemy had been conducting a comprehensive intelligence gathering operation, while simultaneously conditioning Imperial forces for the conflicts to come. The cosmic conditions that enabled Rangdan's success were not merely environmental but psychological and doctrinal. The Great Crusade's emphasis on rapid expansion and efficient conquest created exactly the circumstances the Rangdan needed to study their enemies without triggering defensive responses. Imperial confidence in their technological and military superiority blinded them to the possibility that their enemies might be using fundamentally different approaches to warfare. The very success of the Crusade became a vulnerability that would soon be exploited with devastating effectiveness. As the 920 approached, the northern sectors had become a vast laboratory, where an ancient and patient intelligence conducted experiments on human nature itself. The stage was set for a conflict that would challenge not just Imperial military doctrine, but the fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of life that underpinned human civilization. The transition from mysterious anomaly to recognized threat began with a series of incidents that, individually appeared unremarkable but collectively revealed a pattern of coordinated intelligence operating across the northern galactic sectors. The first documented contact between Imperial forces and what would later be identified as Rangdan advance elements occurred during the compliance action on Advex Moors in 916.M30, though the true significance of this encounter would not be understood until much later. Compliance Fleet 73, under the command of Lord Commander Thaddeus Kryn, had expected Advex Moors to present standard challenges for Imperial conquest. The world harbored a technologically primitive human civilization that had regressed to medieval social structures following the collapse of their Dark Age technology. Initial orbital surveys revealed no unusual xenos presence, and the population showed typical patterns of relief and gratitude at the prospect of Imperial reunification. The compliance action proceeded according to established protocols, with Imperial Army regiments establishing control over major population centers, while Space Marine detachments secured key strategic locations. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came during the routine biological screening of the local population. Imperial medical teams discovered that the humans of Advex Moors displayed genetic markers that had never been cataloged in any other human population. More disturbing was the discovery that these genetic variations appeared to be recent, showing signs of systematic modification rather than natural evolutionary development. The planetary population exhibited enhanced resistance to biological pathogens and improved neural connectivity that suggested deliberate bioengineering. When Imperial geneticists attempted to trace the source of these modifications, they encountered their first glimpse of Rangdan biotechnology. Hidden within the genetic code of the Advex Mors population were what can only be described as biological programs, sequences of DNA that functioned as organic machinery, capable of monitoring, modifying, and even controlling biological processes at the cellular level. These genetic modifications were not crude alterations but sophisticated engineering that demonstrated an understanding of biological systems that exceeded even the most advanced Imperial knowledge. The reaction of the local population to Imperial arrival gradually shifted from grateful cooperation to subtle resistance as the genetic screening continued. Individuals who had initially welcomed the Imperial forces began displaying coordinated behaviors that suggested external influence. They retained their apparent free will and personality, but their priorities and loyalties slowly aligned in ways that benefited an agenda none of them could articulate. Imperial observers noted that the population seemed to be receiving instructions through channels that conventional surveillance could not detect. The breakthrough in understanding came when Magos biologist Karn Vex began analyzing tissue samples from affected individuals under high-powered augmetic microscopy. What he discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and individual identity. The Advex Mors population had been infected with microscopic organisms that existed in perfect symbiosis with human neural tissue. These organisms, which Vex initially classified as a form of biological nanotechnology, were capable of monitoring and influencing thought processes while remaining completely undetectable to the host consciousness. The implications were staggering. The Rangdan had developed the ability to influence human behavior at the neurological level, while preserving the appearance and subjective experience of free will. Infected individuals genuinely believed their thoughts and decisions were their own, even as they unconsciously served agenda that contradicted their stated beliefs and values. This represented a form of warfare that attacked the very concept of individual identity, turning humans into unknowing agents of their own conquest. As Imperial forces on Advex Mors began implementing quarantine protocols, they discovered that the infection was far more widespread than initially suspected. Not only was the entire planetary population affected, but the organisms had already begun spreading to Imperial personnel through routine contact and shared atmospheric exposure. Medical scans revealed that over 40% of Imperial Army troops showed early signs of neural modification, while even Space Marines demonstrated subtle changes in brain chemistry that suggested the beginning stages of infection. The evacuation of Advex Mors became the first test of Imperial containment protocols against a biological threat that operated at the level of consciousness itself. Lord Commander Kryn made the difficult decision to implement immediate quarantine of all personnel who had made planetfall, effectively stranding his own forces on a world that was rapidly becoming uninhabitable. The affected Imperial troops, still believing themselves to be loyal servants of the Emperor, could not understand why their comrades treated them as potential enemies. Similar incidents began manifesting across the northern sectors with increasing frequency throughout 917.M30. The Ironheart Space Marine Company vanished during a routine patrol of the Kalos system, only to reappear 3 months later as perfectly disciplined Imperial forces with no memory of their absence. Medical scans revealed extensive neural modifications that had been implemented with surgical precision, yet the Marines retained all their combat skills and apparent loyalty to the Imperium. Only their tactical priorities had shifted in subtle ways that would not become apparent until they were deployed against Rangdan forces. The Screaming Stars incident of 918.M30 provided the most dramatic evidence of Rangdan capabilities. 3 solar systems in the Morvax sector simultaneously ceased all astropathic communication, their psychic signatures vanishing from the warp as if they had never existed. When Imperial investigation fleets arrived, they found the systems populated by apparently normal human civilizations that claimed to have been in continuous contact with the Imperium. However, detailed analysis revealed that these populations had been completely replaced by biological constructs, perfect replicas of the original inhabitants that possessed all their memories and personalities, but served as extensions of a collective Rangdan intelligence. The discovery of the false astropaths represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of Rangdan infiltration. Sanctioned psychers returning from northern deployments appeared to function normally, passing all standard psychological evaluations and demonstrating their usual psychic abilities. However, they had been subtly reprogrammed to transmit false information through the astropathic network, spreading disinformation that compromised Imperial intelligence gathering across multiple sectors. The realization that the Imperium's primary communication system had been infiltrated forced a complete reassessment of Northern intelligence. By 919.M30, the pattern had become undeniable. The Northern sectors were under systematic attack by an intelligence that operated according to principles that challenged every assumption of Imperial military doctrine. This was not conquest in any recognizable sense, but a gradual process of assimilation that preserved the appearance of normal Imperial operations while slowly converting human populations into extensions of an alien collective consciousness. The recognition of systematic neural infiltration across multiple systems triggered the first major security reorganization of the Great Crusade. The threat posed by the Rangdan was qualitatively different from any xenos species previously encountered. They did not seek to destroy or enslave humanity, but to transform it into something that was no longer recognizably human while preserving the illusion of continuity. This represented a form of extinction that was more terrifying than simple annihilation, as it offered the horror of losing one's essential nature while retaining the capacity to understand the loss. The Northern expansion was officially halted in 920.M30 pending a comprehensive investigation of the threat, but by then, the Rangdan had already achieved their primary objective. They had studied Imperial military doctrine, analyzed human psychology, and established infiltration networks that extended far beyond the northern sectors. The stage was set for a conflict that would test not just Imperial military might, but the very foundations of human identity and consciousness. The emergence of the Rangdan as a recognized threat marked the end of the Great Crusade's Age of Innocence. For the first time, Imperial forces faced an enemy that could not be defeated through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but required a fundamental reassessment of what it meant to be human in a galaxy where consciousness itself had become a battlefield. The documentary evidence from the initial confrontations with identified Rangdan forces reveals a pattern of encounters that systematically dismantled Imperial confidence in their military superiority. Unlike previous xenos conflicts where superior Imperial technology and tactics had proven decisive, engagements with Rangdan entities demonstrated capabilities that violated fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. The surviving records from this period, fragmentary though they are, paint a picture of an enemy that had evolved beyond conventional military thinking into something that challenged the basic concepts of individual identity and biological integrity. The Gyros-Thravian massacre of early 918.M30 stands as the first fully documented example of Rangdan biological warfare in action. The 47th Mordian Iron Guard Regiment, comprising over 12,000 veteran soldiers, had established a standard Imperial garrison on the world following successful compliance operations. The regiment's commanding officer, Colonel Vost Meridian, reported normal operations for 3 standard months before transmitting a routine status update that would be his final coherent communication. The massacre began not with external attack, but with internal dissolution. Surveillance recordings recovered from the garrison show Imperial Guard soldiers turning their weapons against their comrades with mechanical precision, showing no emotional distress or apparent awareness that their actions were contrary to their training and loyalty. What made the incident particularly horrifying was that the affected soldiers continued to follow standard Imperial protocols even as they systematically executed their uninfected comrades. They maintained proper formation, followed chain of command, and even conducted formal burial rites for their victims. Biological analysis of the perpetrators revealed that their neural tissue had been infiltrated by what Imperial xenobiologists classified as cognitive parasites, microscopic organisms that had integrated so completely with human brain function that they were essentially indistinguishable from natural neural components. These parasites did not control their hosts in any crude sense, but rather modified their decision-making processes at such a fundamental level that the affected individuals genuinely believed their actions were consistent with their duties as Imperial soldiers. The vanishing of the Iron Hearts demonstrated Rangdan capabilities at an even more sophisticated level. The entire 3rd Company of the Iron Hearts chapter, comprising 120 Space Marines under Captain Gorvain Thex, disappeared during a patrol sweep of the Vorthax system. Standard search protocols were implemented, but no trace of the Marines or their equipment could be found. The company's Thunderhawks were discovered in perfect condition on their designated patrol route, with no signs of struggle or external interference. 3 months later, The Ironheart's third company reappeared at their home base, reporting successful completion of their patrol mission. Medical examinations revealed them to be in perfect physical condition, with their gene seed showing no signs of contamination or degradation. Their memories of the missing months were consistent and detailed, describing routine patrol activities and minor engagements with local fauna. However, comprehensive neurological scans revealed extensive modifications to their brain tissue that had been implemented with surgical precision exceeding even Imperial medical capabilities. The modified Marines continued to function as loyal Imperial forces for several months, demonstrating no behavioral anomalies that violated their oaths of service. However, when deployed against confirmed Rangdan positions, they displayed tactical insights that suggested access to intelligence sources beyond their reported experiences. Their combat effectiveness against Rangdan forces was remarkably poor, with engagement patterns that seemed designed to preserve enemy assets rather than achieve victory. The realization that even Space Marines could be compromised and reprogrammed while retaining their apparent loyalty created a crisis of confidence that rippled through Imperial command structures. The Screaming Stars incident provided the most comprehensive demonstration of Rangdan power projection across interstellar distances. The Vorthak, Kepler-7 and Hadron systems, spread across over 50 light-years, simultaneously ceased all astropathic communication. Investigation fleets dispatched to each system found apparently normal human populations that claimed continuous loyalty to the Imperium and expressed confusion about any perceived communication difficulties. Detailed analysis revealed the true scope of Rangdan capabilities. The entire populations of all three systems had been systematically replaced by biological constructs that possessed complete memories and personalities of the original inhabitants. These replacements were not crude copies, but perfect duplicates that included genetic markers, learned behaviors, and even psychological quirks that made them indistinguishable from the originals, except through the most sophisticated testing. More disturbing was the discovery that these replacement populations had been created using biological material harvested from the original inhabitants, meaning that the constructs were literally composed of the people they were replacing. The Rangdan had developed the ability to break down living beings at the molecular level and reconstruct them as extensions of their collective intelligence while preserving every aspect of individual identity except ultimate loyalty and purpose. The false astropaths incident revealed perhaps the most insidious aspect of Rangdan infiltration capabilities. Sanctioned psychers who had served in northern sectors began displaying subtle changes in their psychic transmissions that went undetected by standard monitoring protocols. These compromised astropaths continued to perform their duties with apparent competence, but their messages carried embedded information that served Rangdan intelligence gathering operations. The modification of astropaths required capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. The Rangdan had somehow learned to influence psychic abilities without disrupting the delicate neural structures that enabled warped communication. Compromised psychers showed no decrease in their psychic strength or accuracy, but their transmissions carried subliminal elements that provided the Rangdan with detailed intelligence about Imperial operations across multiple sectors. Imperial reactions to these manifestations varied dramatically depending on the level of command and access to classified information. Frontline commanders, lacking complete intelligence about Rangdan capabilities, interpreted the incidents as evidence of sophisticated but ultimately conventional xenos infiltration. They implemented standard security protocols and increased surveillance of personnel returning from northern deployments. Higher-level Imperial authorities, with access to more comprehensive analysis, recognized that they faced a threat unlike anything in their experience. The Rangdan represented not just military opposition but a fundamental challenge to the concept of individual identity. The enemy's ability to modify human consciousness while preserving the appearance of free will raised questions about the nature of loyalty, duty, and personal responsibility that had no precedent in Imperial doctrine. The escalating complexity of each incident demonstrated that the Rangdan were conducting systematic experiments on Imperial forces, testing the limits of their biological manipulation capabilities while gathering intelligence about human psychology and military organization. Each encounter revealed new aspects of their power while simultaneously demonstrating that previous assessments had dramatically underestimated the scope of the threat. The variety of Rangdan capabilities displayed during this period suggested an intelligence that had been studying human biology and psychology for far longer than Imperial expansion into the northern sectors. The precision of their neural modifications and the sophistication of their biological constructs indicated centuries or possibly millennia of research into human nature. The Imperium found itself fighting an enemy that understood them better than they understood themselves. By late 918.M30, Imperial military doctrine was in crisis. Standard tactical responses proved ineffective against an enemy that could turn Imperial strengths into weaknesses through biological manipulation. The very qualities that made Imperial forces effective, loyalty, discipline, and unit cohesion, became vulnerabilities when the enemy could corrupt these virtues while preserving their surface appearance. The psychological impact on Imperial personnel was perhaps as significant as the direct military threat. The knowledge that consciousness itself could be modified without the awareness of the affected individual created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that undermined the unity essential for effective military operations. Imperial forces found themselves not only fighting an external enemy but constantly questioning the authenticity of their own thoughts and loyalties. The Imperial military machine that encountered the Rangdan threat represented the apex of human military achievement, a force that had conquered thousands of worlds and brought countless alien civilizations to heel through superior organization, technology, and doctrine. Understanding the magnitude of the Rangdan challenge requires first appreciating the unprecedented capabilities that the Great Crusade had assembled by the early decades of the 30th millennium. The 18 Space Marine legions stood as the primary instrument of Imperial expansion, each comprising over 100,000 warriors who represented the pinnacle of human biological enhancement. These post-human soldiers possessed capabilities that exceeded baseline human limitations by orders of magnitude. Their enhanced physiology allowed them to operate in environments that would kill normal humans within minutes, while their advanced armor and weapons gave them firepower equivalent to entire conventional military units. More importantly, the Space Marines represented a revolution in military psychology and organization. Unlike conventional armies that relied on external discipline and motivation, the legions were bound together by genetic conditioning, shared purpose, and absolute loyalty to their primarchs and the Emperor. This unity of purpose had proven decisive in countless campaigns, allowing Space Marine forces to coordinate complex operations across vast distances with minimal communication. Each legion had developed its own tactical specializations and cultural characteristics that reflected the influence of their primarch's leadership and the worlds from which they recruited. The Imperial Fists excelled at siege warfare and defensive operations, while the World Eaters specialized in close combat and rapid assault. The Death Guard were masters of attrition warfare and chemical weapons, and the Thousand Sons had developed psychic capabilities that enhanced their tactical effectiveness in ways that bordered on prescience. Supporting the Space Marine legions was the Imperial Army, a force numbering in the billions that provided the manpower necessary to garrison conquered worlds and conduct large-scale operations that exceeded even Legion capabilities. Imperial Army regiments were recruited from across the galaxy, bringing diverse tactical traditions and specialized capabilities that complemented the standardized excellence of the legions. Mordian Iron Guard regiments provided disciplined infantry formations. Talarn Desert Raiders excelled at mechanized warfare in harsh environments, and Volstroyan Firstborn combined advanced technology with unshakable morale. The technological foundation of Imperial military power rested on the alliance with the Mechanicum of Mars, whose forge worlds produced the weapons, vehicles, and equipment that enabled Imperial forces to operate across the galaxy. Bolters, power armor, and void ships represented technologies that were superior to anything produced by human civilization since the Dark Age of technology. More importantly, the Mechanicum provided the logistical infrastructure necessary to maintain and supply military operations across interstellar distances. Imperial doctrine emphasized rapid conquest through overwhelming force, followed by efficient integration of conquered territories into the growing Imperium. This approach had proven remarkably successful against conventional opponents, allowing Imperial forces to maintain momentum that prevented enemies from organizing effective resistance. The speed of Imperial expansion was itself a weapon, denying potential opponents the time necessary to prepare adequate defenses or coordinate with other threatened civilizations. The Astropathic Communication Network provided the Imperium with unprecedented strategic coordination capabilities. Sanctioned psychers trained on Terra could transmit messages across thousands of light-years instantaneously, allowing Imperial commanders to coordinate operations across multiple sectors simultaneously. This communication advantage gave Imperial forces superior intelligence and coordination compared to most enemies, who were limited to conventional faster-than-light communication methods. Command and control systems had evolved to manage military operations on a galactic scale, with standardized protocols that allowed different Imperial forces to coordinate effectively even when meeting for the first time. The Imperial military hierarchy provided clear chains of command that extended from individual squad leaders up to the Emperor himself, ensuring that strategic decisions could be implemented efficiently across vast distances and diverse force compositions. The psychological foundations of Imperial military power were perhaps even more significant than the technological advantages. Imperial forces fought with a confidence that came from serving the rightful rulers of humanity, armed with superior weapons and guided by the Emperor's vision of human unity. This sense of purpose and destiny had proven decisive in countless encounters, allowing Imperial forces to maintain morale and effectiveness even under extreme conditions. Imperial intelligence services had developed sophisticated methods for analyzing enemy capabilities and predicting their likely responses to Imperial military pressure. The various arms of Imperial intelligence gathering, from Mechanicum reconnaissance to Space Marine scouts to Imperial Army reconnaissance units, provided commanders with detailed information about enemy forces and capabilities that enabled precise tactical planning. The Great Crusade's success had created a self-reinforcing cycle of expansion and strengthening. Each conquered world provided new resources and recruits that increased Imperial military capabilities, while each victory demonstrated Imperial superiority to potential enemies and allies alike. This momentum had become a strategic asset in itself, as many civilizations chose to join the Imperium voluntarily rather than face conquest. However, the very success of Imperial expansion had created subtle vulnerabilities that would prove critical when facing the Rangdan threat. The speed of conquest had created supply lines that became increasingly stretched as Imperial forces pushed deeper into unexplored regions. Standard resupply protocols assumed predictable travel times and reliable communication networks, creating dependencies that could be exploited by enemies who understood Imperial logistical requirements. The standardization that made Imperial forces so effective also created predictable patterns that could be studied and countered by patient opponents. Imperial tactical doctrine, while sophisticated and battle-tested, was based on assumptions about enemy behavior that had proven valid against conventional opponents but might not apply to truly alien intelligences operating according to different principles. Perhaps most significantly, Imperial success had fostered a confidence that bordered on arrogance regarding human superiority over alien civilizations. The consistent pattern of Imperial victory had created an expectation that superior technology and organization would inevitably triumph over alien innovation or adaptation. This psychological foundation would prove inadequate when facing an enemy that had specifically evolved to counter human advantages. The organizational methods that enabled rapid Imperial expansion also created pathways for infiltration by enemies who understood human psychology and military hierarchy. The clear command structures and standardized protocols that made Imperial forces so effective could be exploited by opponents who could mimic Imperial authority or compromise key personnel without detection. The Great Crusade's emphasis on bringing human worlds into compliance had created extensive contact between Imperial forces and diverse human populations, many of which had been isolated for millennia, and had developed along divergent cultural and biological paths. This contact, while necessary for Imperial reunification, also provided opportunities for biological contamination or cultural influence that could spread through Imperial forces without immediate detection. The integration of diverse human cultures into the Imperial military had generally been seen as a source of strength, providing tactical diversity and cultural resilience that enhanced overall Imperial capabilities. However, this diversity also meant that behavioral variations among Imperial personnel were often attributed to cultural differences, rather than potential external influence, creating blind spots in security protocols that could be exploited by sophisticated enemies. As the Great Crusade reached its peak expansion velocity in the early decades of the 30th millennium, these hidden vulnerabilities remained largely theoretical concerns. The consistent success of Imperial forces across thousands of campaigns had validated the fundamental assumptions underlying Imperial military doctrine. The stage was set for an encounter with an enemy that would challenge not just Imperial military capabilities, but the foundational beliefs about human nature and alien threats that had guided the Great Crusade's remarkable success. The Golden Age foundations of imperial power represented humanity's greatest military achievement, but they were about to be tested by a threat that had evolved specifically to exploit the assumptions and methods that had made that achievement possible. The collision between imperial confidence and Rangdan patience would determine not just the fate of the northern sectors, but the fundamental direction of human development for millennia to come. The Rangdan approach to expansion represented a philosophical paradigm fundamentally alien to imperial military doctrine, operating on principles that challenged every assumption about conquest, territory, and the nature of victory itself. Where the Imperium sought to impose unity through force and cultural assimilation, the Rangdan pursued a patient methodology of biological integration that preserved existing structures while gradually transforming their essential nature. This approach proved devastatingly effective against an enemy that had been conditioned to recognize threats in terms of open military opposition rather than subtle biological transformation. The core Rangdan philosophy, as reconstructed from fragmentary intelligence gathered during the conflicts, centered on the concept of evolutionary convergence, the belief that all intelligent life would eventually achieve optimal efficiency through biological unity. From their perspective, warfare was not about the destruction or subjugation of enemies, but about accelerating the natural process by which diverse biological forms would merge into a single perfected organism. Individual identity, consciousness, and free will were viewed not as inherent rights but as temporary evolutionary phases that would naturally give way to collective optimization. This philosophical framework informed every aspect of Rangdan expansion methodology. Rather than seeking to destroy existing civilizations, they worked to gradually modify them until the distinction between conqueror and conquered became meaningless. The process was designed to be so gradual that affected populations would never recognize that fundamental changes were occurring, experiencing the transformation as natural evolution rather than external imposition. The technical implementation of Rangdan expansion relied on sophisticated biological agents that operated at multiple levels simultaneously. At the microscopic level, specially engineered organisms would infiltrate target populations through environmental contamination, gradually modifying genetic structures to enhance compatibility with Rangdan collective consciousness. These modifications were implemented so slowly that they appeared to be natural genetic variation, often spanning multiple generations before achieving their intended effects. At the neural level, Rangdan biotechnology employed what Imperial scientists termed cognitive symbionts, microscopic organisms that formed symbiotic relationships with host neural tissue. These symbionts enhanced their host's cognitive abilities while gradually aligning their decision-making processes with collective Rangdan objectives. The enhancement effects made affected individuals more effective at their original roles, creating positive reinforcement that encouraged the spread of infection through voluntary contact. The psychological dimension of Rangdan expansion proved perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their methodology. Rather than attempting to override individual personality and motivation, Rangdan influence worked by gradually shifting the context within which decisions were made. Affected individuals retained their apparent free will and continued to act according to their stated beliefs and values. But those beliefs and values were slowly modified to align with Rangdan objectives. Successful implementations of Rangdan expansion methodology appeared across dozens of worlds throughout the northern sectors, each following a predictable pattern despite the apparent diversity of local conditions. The process typically began with environmental contamination that introduced Rangdan biological agents into local ecosystems. These agents would initially appear as beneficial mutations that enhanced crop yields, improved disease resistance, or provided other advantages that encouraged their adoption by local populations. The second phase involved the gradual modification of key individuals within target populations, focusing particularly on leaders, technical specialists, and individuals with access to communication networks. These modifications enhanced their natural abilities, while introducing subtle changes in judgment and priority that served Rangdan objectives. The enhanced individuals would naturally rise to positions of greater influence, accelerating the spread of Rangdan influence throughout their communities. The third phase witnessed the systematic transformation of entire populations as Rangdan biological agents reached critical concentration levels. At this point, the distinction between original inhabitants and Rangdan constructs became largely meaningless, as the biological integration had proceeded to the point where individual identity existed only as an expression of collective will. The reactions of other galactic powers to Rangdan expansion varied dramatically, depending on their understanding of the threat and their own capabilities for response. The Eldar, with their sophisticated understanding of biological manipulation and psychic phenomena, recognized the Rangdan threat relatively early and implemented strict quarantine protocols around suspected contamination zones. However, their warnings to Imperial authorities were dismissed as typical alien deception designed to limit human expansion. The Mechanicum initially showed great interest in Rangdan biotechnology, viewing their biological manipulation capabilities as a potential source of innovation for Imperial military applications. Several Forge worlds requested samples of Rangdan organisms for analysis, inadvertently facilitating the spread of contamination through Mechanicum research networks. The realization that their own augmetic enhancements provided no protection against Rangdan influence came too late to prevent significant infiltration of key Mechanicum facilities. Growing complications in Imperial response to Rangdan expansion arose from the fundamental mismatch between Imperial military doctrine and the nature of the threat they faced. Standard Imperial protocols for dealing with xenos threats emphasized rapid identification, isolation, and destruction of enemy forces. However, the Rangdan presented no clear military targets and employed no conventional weapons or tactics that could be countered through superior firepower. Imperial intelligence services struggled to gather accurate information about Rangdan capabilities and intentions because their standard methods relied on analyzing enemy communications, troop movements, and resource allocation. The Rangdan operated through biological networks that transmitted information through genetic modification and cellular communication, making their coordination invisible to conventional surveillance methods. The gradual recognition of the true scope of Rangdan influence created cascading problems throughout Imperial command structures. As the extent of biological contamination became apparent, standard security protocols proved inadequate for distinguishing between loyal Imperial personnel and individuals who had been subtly compromised. The paranoia and suspicion generated by this uncertainty undermined unit cohesion and command effectiveness at precisely the moment when unity was most essential. Imperial responses inadvertently aided Rangdan expansion through several mechanisms that revealed the sophisticated understanding their enemies had developed of human psychology and organizational behavior. Quarantine protocols designed to contain biological contamination often concentrated affected individuals in ways that accelerated the spread of Rangdan influence. Medical examinations intended to identify compromised personnel provided the Rangdan with detailed information about Imperial biological and psychological assessment methods. Most significantly, Imperial efforts to combat Rangdan influence through increased surveillance and security measures created exactly the conditions of stress and suspicion that made personnel more susceptible to the psychological aspects of Rangdan conversion. The enhanced cognitive abilities provided by Rangdan's symbionts appeared particularly attractive to individuals under pressure, creating voluntary adoption of contamination among personnel who believed they were serving Imperial interests. The philosophical implications of Rangdan expansion methodology challenged fundamental Imperial assumptions about the nature of humanity and individual identity. Imperial doctrine emphasized the inherent superiority of pure human biology and the importance of individual consciousness as the foundation of human achievement. The Rangdan demonstrated that these concepts were not fixed realities but malleable characteristics that could be modified while preserving the appearance of continuity. Regional variations in Rangdan expansion reflected their adaptive approach to local conditions and populations. On worlds with strong military traditions, the integration process emphasized enhancement of combat effectiveness and tactical thinking. On technical worlds, Rangdan influence focused on improving innovation and problem-solving capabilities. On agricultural worlds, the emphasis was placed on biological harmony and environmental optimization. These variations created the illusion that different Rangdan populations were pursuing independent objectives, when in fact they represented coordinated aspects of a single expansion strategy adapted to local conditions. Imperial analysts who attempted to exploit apparent divisions between different Rangdan populations found themselves manipulated by an intelligence that had anticipated and planned for such responses. The cultural impact of Rangdan expansion extended beyond immediate biological effects to influence Imperial attitudes toward alien life and biological purity. Reports of the sophisticated biological manipulation capabilities displayed by the Rangdan began to influence Imperial policy regarding xenospecies, leading to increased emphasis on complete extermination rather than subjugation or integration. The fear that other alien species might possess similar capabilities drove the development of increasingly extreme measures for dealing with xenos threats. The success of Rangdan expansion methodology in the northern sectors provided a template that would influence their approach to the larger conflict with the Imperium. The patient, adaptive strategies that had proven effective against isolated human worlds were scaled up to target the Imperial military machine itself, turning the Imperium's own strengths and assumptions into weapons for its own transformation. The subtle anomalies that marked the beginning of widespread Rangdan infiltration into Imperial forces initially appeared as minor variations in performance and behavior that fell well within normal ranges of individual difference. Imperial medical and psychological evaluation protocols, designed to identify gross abnormalities rather than subtle enhancements, failed to detect the early stages of biological modification that represented the Rangdan's most insidious weapon against human independence. The first documented cases of what would later be recognized as Rangdan neuromodification appeared in the personnel files of the 23rd Expeditionary Fleet following their extended operations in the Kepler sector during late 917.M30. Fleet medical officers noted that several officers and enlisted personnel had begun demonstrating improved performance in their assigned duties, showing enhanced pattern recognition, improved tactical thinking, and remarkably accurate intuitions about enemy behavior and environmental conditions. These improvements were initially celebrated as evidence of the beneficial effects of extended combat experience and the adaptive capabilities of Imperial personnel under challenging conditions. Commendations were issued to individuals who showed exceptional performance, and several were promoted to positions of greater responsibility. The medical staff attributed the enhancements to natural adaptation and the psychological benefits of successful military operations. More detailed analysis revealed disturbing patterns beneath the surface improvements. Personnel showing enhanced capabilities demonstrated remarkably similar changes in brain chemistry, with increased activity in regions associated with pattern recognition and decreased activity in areas linked to individual decision-making and emotional response. These changes were subtle enough to avoid detection during standard medical examinations, but significant enough to fundamentally alter cognitive processing patterns. The affected individuals showed no awareness of any changes in their mental functioning and genuinely believed that their improved performance resulted from natural development of their existing abilities. When questioned directly, they could provide detailed explanations for their enhanced capabilities that seemed entirely reasonable and were consistent with their personal histories and training backgrounds. However, detailed psychological evaluation revealed that their explanations had been constructed post hoc to rationalize changes they could not consciously recognize. Behavioral analysis conducted by Imperial psychologists revealed additional anomalies that suggested external influence on thought processes. Affected personnel showed increased interest in biological specimens and alien life forms, often requesting permission to maintain personal collections of samples from their operations. They demonstrated unusual empathy for alien psychology and showed remarkable ability to predict enemy tactical responses, often making strategic recommendations that proved extraordinarily effective despite having no apparent basis in their reported observations. The growing frequency of such cases throughout late 917.M30 and early 918.M30 created concern among senior Imperial medical officers, who began implementing enhanced screening protocols for personnel returning from Northern Sector operations. However, these enhanced protocols were themselves compromised by the fact that several of the medical personnel conducting the examinations had themselves been subjected to Rangdan modification, creating a systematic bias toward interpreting anomalous results as normal variations. Failed explanations for the observed phenomena proliferated throughout Imperial medical and scientific communities, as researchers attempted to account for the consistent patterns of enhancement without acknowledging the possibility of external biological intervention. Some theorists proposed that the northern sectors contained environmental factors that naturally enhanced human cognitive capabilities, leading to recommendations for extended deployment of key personnel to these regions. Others suggested that the improvements represented emergent effects of Imperial genetic enhancement programs, arguing that the combination of space marine gene seed technology and environmental pressures was producing beneficial mutations in baseline human populations. These theories led to increased interest in studying the affected personnel and potentially replicating their enhancements in other Imperial forces. The most insidious aspect of these failed explanations was that they contained elements of truth that made them compelling to Imperial researchers. The affected personnel did demonstrate genuine improvements in their capabilities, and the enhancements did appear to build upon existing Imperial biotechnology rather than replacing it entirely. The Rangdan had designed their intervention to work with human biology rather than against it, making their influence appear as natural development rather than alien manipulation. Rationalizations for the anomalous patterns became increasingly elaborate as more data accumulated throughout 918.M30. Imperial researchers developed complex theories about psychological adaptation, environmental influence, and the effects of extended combat exposure that explained individual cases while missing the systematic pattern that connected them. The compartmentalized nature of Imperial research, designed to maintain security through information isolation, prevented researchers from accessing the comprehensive data that would have revealed the true scope of the infiltration. The underlying causes of the observed phenomena began to emerge through the painstaking research of Magos biologist Kyron Vex, whose comprehensive analysis of tissue samples from affected personnel revealed the presence of microscopic organisms that had achieved perfect integration with human neural tissue. These organisms, which Vex termed cognitive parasites, demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in Imperial biological knowledge. The parasites operated by forming symbiotic relationships with neurons, enhancing their efficiency while gradually modifying their function to serve collective rather than individual purposes. The process was so sophisticated that the enhanced neurons actually performed better than unmodified tissue, creating genuine improvements in cognitive capability that masked the fundamental changes in motivation and loyalty that accompanied the enhancement. Vex's research revealed that the cognitive parasites were not simple organisms but complex biological machines that carried genetic information, manufactured specialized proteins, and maintained communication networks with other infected individuals through methods that remained largely incomprehensible to Imperial science. The parasites appeared to be designed specifically to interface with human neural architecture, suggesting that their creators possessed detailed knowledge of human biology that exceeded even Imperial understanding. The clues to underlying causes pointed toward a coordinated intelligence that had been studying human biology and psychology for extended periods, possibly centuries or millennia. The precision of the neural modifications and the sophisticated understanding of human organizational behavior demonstrated by the parasites suggested that the Rangdan had been preparing for contact with humanity long before Imperial expansion reached the northern sectors. Growing awareness of the true nature of the threat created a cascade of secondary problems throughout Imperial command structures. The realization that personnel could be compromised without their knowledge or the knowledge of their superiors undermined confidence in standard security protocols and created an atmosphere of suspicion that interfered with normal military operations. The discovery that the parasites could remain dormant for extended periods before activation meant that personnel who had served in northern sectors months or years earlier might still pose security risks. This revelation forced Imperial authorities to consider the possibility that the infiltration had spread far beyond the northern sectors through normal personnel rotation and transfer procedures. Perhaps most disturbing was the recognition that the enhanced capabilities provided by the parasites made affected individuals more effective at their assigned duties, creating a perverse incentive structure where the most competent and successful personnel were most likely to be compromised. This meant that standard military promotion and recognition procedures were inadvertently selecting for individuals who had been modified by enemy action. The psychological impact on unaffected Imperial personnel was severe, as the knowledge that thoughts and loyalties could be modified without awareness created existential anxiety about the authenticity of their own mental processes. Personnel began second-guessing their own motivations and decisions, leading to decreased effectiveness and increased psychological casualties that further weakened Imperial operations. Imperial attempts to develop countermeasures for the parasites faced fundamental challenges related to their sophisticated integration with human neural tissue. Standard biological warfare antidotes proved ineffective because the parasites had evolved to mimic natural neural components so closely that destroying them would cause irreversible brain damage to the host. Surgical removal was impossible due to the microscopic size and dispersed distribution of the organisms throughout affected neural tissue. The recognition that Rangdan infiltration represented a form of biological warfare that attacked consciousness itself forced Imperial authorities to confront philosophical questions about the nature of human identity and free will that had no precedent in their experience. The enemy had weaponized the very concepts of loyalty and duty that formed the foundation of Imperial military effectiveness, creating a threat that could not be countered through conventional military responses. By mid-918.m30, the pattern of corruption had become undeniable to senior Imperial commanders with access to comprehensive intelligence reports. The northern sectors were no longer simply contested territory, but had become a laboratory where an alien intelligence conducted systematic experiments on human nature itself. The stage was set for a fundamental reassessment of Imperial military doctrine and the development of countermeasures that would prove as disturbing as the threat they were designed to address. The first signs of corruption had revealed an enemy that understood humanity better than humanity understood itself, turning Imperial strengths into vulnerabilities through biological manipulation that preserved the appearance of loyalty while serving alien objectives. The realization that consciousness itself had become a battlefield would force the Imperium to make choices that violated every principle they claimed to uphold, beginning a transformation that would echo through the millennia in ways the architects of Imperial policy could never have anticipated. The nature of the Rangdan threat that emerged in full clarity during 919.m30 represented a form of warfare that operated simultaneously across multiple dimensions of human existence, combining conventional military capabilities with biological manipulation, psychological warfare, and what can only be described as ontological assault, an attack on the very nature of being human. This multi-dimensional approach created a threat matrix that defied every assumption underlying Imperial military doctrine, and forced a fundamental reassessment of what victory and defeat meant in the context of species survival. The conventional military capabilities of the Rangdan, while formidable, served primarily as a delivery system for their more exotic weapons, rather than as their primary means of conquest. Rangdan combat forms demonstrated biotechnology that exceeded Imperial capabilities in several key areas, particularly in the integration of living weapons with their users, and the ability to rapidly adapt tactical responses based on real-time biological feedback from combat situations. Rangdan warriors, if the term could be applied to creatures that seem to exist as extensions of a collective intelligence rather than individual combatants, displayed combat effectiveness that rivaled Space Marines while demonstrating capabilities that no Imperial force could match. Their weapons were not manufactured tools but living extensions of their biology, capable of modifying their function in response to battlefield conditions and enemy countermeasures. The first major confrontation between Imperial forces and identified Rangdan military assets occurred during the siege of Advex Moors in early 919. Men 30, when the 12th Imperial Fists Company under Captain Sigismund attempted to establish a beachhead on the world that had become the primary focus of Rangdan expansion in the Kepler sector. The engagement provided Imperial forces with their first comprehensive look at Rangdan combat capabilities, and revealed the full extent of the challenge they faced. The Rangdan defense of Advex Moors demonstrated tactical coordination that exceeded anything Imperial forces had previously encountered, with individual combat units responding to changing battlefield conditions with perfect synchronization despite having no apparent communication systems. More disturbing was the discovery that Rangdan forces seemed to anticipate Imperial tactical responses with uncanny accuracy, countering standard Space Marine assault patterns with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of Imperial military doctrine. The biological weapons employed by Rangdan forces during the siege operated on principles that challenged Imperial understanding of the boundaries between living and non-living matter. Rangdan projectiles would burrow into Imperial armor and begin consuming the metal to fuel their own growth, eventually breaching even power armor through sustained biological degradation. Their defensive positions incorporated living fortifications that could repair damage in real time and adapt their structure to counter specific Imperial assault tactics. Most unsettling was the discovery that Rangdan forces seemed to be conducting systematic experiments on captured Imperial personnel during the combat operations themselves. Imperial soldiers who were taken prisoner and later recovered showed evidence of rapid biological modification that had occurred during their brief captivity, including enhanced physical capabilities and modified neural structures that suggested the Rangdan could implement their conversion process in a matter of hours rather than the months previously observed. The escalating conflict revealed that the Rangdan possessed strategic capabilities that extended far beyond their immediate military assets. Intelligence analysis conducted during and after the Advex Mors siege revealed that Rangdan forces had been coordinating their activities across multiple star systems simultaneously, implementing complex strategic plans that suggested planning capabilities and resource coordination that exceeded anything Imperial forces had encountered. The psychological warfare aspects of Rangdan operations proved as devastating as their biological weapons. Rangdan forces demonstrated detailed knowledge of Imperial personnel records, unit histories, and even personal information about individual soldiers that they used to create targeted psychological attacks designed to undermine morale and unit cohesion. Imperial forces found themselves fighting an enemy that knew their names, their fears, and their personal histories with uncanny accuracy. Growing seriousness of the Rangdan threat became apparent as Imperial forces discovered that their standard tactical responses were not only ineffective but were actually being anticipated and exploited by enemy forces. The Rangdan had clearly studied Imperial military doctrine in detail and had developed countermeasures for every standard Imperial assault pattern, defensive formation, and strategic approach. The desperate measures implemented by Imperial commanders during this period included the authorization of previously forbidden weapons and tactics that violated established Imperial protocols for engagement with Xenos forces, the use of chemical weapons, biological agents, and area denial munitions became standard practice in anti-Rangdan operations, marking the first time in the Great Crusade that Imperial forces had been forced to abandon their principles of proportional response and discriminate targeting. Captain Sigismund's tactical reports from the Advex Mors siege described the gradual realization that Imperial forces were not fighting individual enemies, but were engaged in combat with what appeared to be a single distributed organism that happened to manifest as separate physical entities. This recognition forced a fundamental shift in Imperial tactical thinking, as traditional concepts of battlefield control and enemy elimination became meaningless when applied to a collective intelligence. The extreme responses authorized during this period included the first use of exterminatus protocols against a world that contained significant human populations. The decision to implement cyclonic torpedo bombardment of Advex Mors represented a watershed moment in Imperial policy, establishing the precedent that human lives could be sacrificed to prevent the spread of xenos contamination. This decision would have profound implications for Imperial doctrine throughout the remainder of the Great Crusade and beyond. Intelligence reports from this period reveal the Rangdan threat's ability to corrupt the very foundations of Imperial military effectiveness through their systematic exploitation of human psychology and organizational behavior. Rangdan infiltration of Imperial command structures had reached the point where strategic intelligence was being compromised at the highest levels, with battle plans and troop movements being anticipated by enemy forces with such accuracy that Imperial operations frequently walked into perfectly prepared ambushes. The point of crisis that prompted direct Imperial intervention came with the recognition that the Rangdan threat was not contained to the northern sectors, but was actively spreading throughout Imperial space through the normal movement of personnel, equipment, and supplies. Contaminated individuals and materials were carrying Rangdan biological agents to worlds throughout the Imperium, creating the potential for simultaneous outbreaks across hundreds of systems. The threat assessment conducted by the Imperial War Council in late 919.AM30 concluded that the Rangdan represented an existential threat to human civilization that required unprecedented response measures. The assessment noted that conventional military victory against the Rangdan was impossible because their true weapon was not military force but the gradual transformation of humanity itself into something that served Rangdan objectives while maintaining the illusion of human independence. The Emperor's personal attention to the Rangdan crisis began during this period, as reports from the northern sectors made clear that the threat could not be contained through conventional military operations. The decision to allocate significant Imperial resources to the anti-Rangdan campaign marked the first time during the Great Crusade that expansion operations had been suspended to address a defensive threat, representing a fundamental shift in Imperial strategic priorities. The growing recognition that the Rangdan possessed capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life, consciousness, and individual identity forced Imperial authorities to confront philosophical questions that had no precedent in human experience. The enemy they faced was not simply more advanced or more powerful than previous opponents, but operated according to principles that made traditional concepts of victory and defeat meaningless. The Imperial response to the Rangdan threat during 920. Men 30 marked the first time in the history of the Great Crusade that Imperial forces abandoned established principles of warfare and began experimenting with weapons and tactics that violated the fundamental philosophical foundations of Imperial military doctrine. The desperate innovations developed during this period would establish precedents that would haunt the Imperium for millennia, creating capabilities that were as dangerous to humanity as the enemies they were designed to defeat. The abandonment of Imperial principles began with the suspension of restrictions on biological warfare research that had been in place since the unification of Terra. The threat posed by Rangdan biological manipulation forced Imperial scientists to develop countermeasures that required them to study and replicate the very techniques they were trying to defeat. The Divisio Biologicis, previously focused on defensive measures and medical applications, was given unlimited resources and authorization to pursue research that had previously been classified as heretical. Project Terminus, initiated under the direct authority of the Emperor himself, represented the most ambitious attempt to develop weapons capable of defeating the Rangdan threat through absolute biological destruction. The project brought together the most brilliant minds from across the Imperium, including members of the Mechanicum, the nascent apothecary orders, and specialists in xenobiology, who had previously worked on defensive applications of their knowledge. The fundamental challenge faced by Project Terminus researchers was developing weapons that could destroy Rangdan biological agents without causing equivalent damage to human biology. The sophisticated integration of Rangdan organisms with human neural tissue meant that conventional biological weapons would kill the host along with the parasite, making them unsuitable for treating infected Imperial personnel or clearing contaminated areas where human survivors might remain. The solution developed by the Terminus research teams involved the creation of what they termed biological paradox weapons, organisms that were designed to target specific genetic markers unique to Rangdan biology while leaving human tissue unaffected. These weapons required detailed understanding of Rangdan genetic structure that could only be obtained through extensive experimentation on captured Rangdan organisms and infected human subjects. The ethical implications of the research required for Terminus weapons development forced Imperial authorities to authorize practices that violated every principle of human dignity and individual rights that the Great Crusade claimed to champion. Living subjects, both volunteers and prisoners, were subjected to controlled Rangdan infection, followed by experimental treatments that had mortality rates exceeding 90%. The justification for these experiments was that the alternative was the extinction of human consciousness as an independent phenomenon. Dangerous experiments conducted during this period included attempts to create enhanced humans who would be immune to Rangdan influence while retaining the cognitive improvements that Rangdan modification provided. These experiments required researchers to understand the mechanisms of Rangdan neural modification well enough to replicate its beneficial effects while blocking its control aspects. The failure rate of these experiments was catastrophic, with test subjects frequently dying or suffering irreversible psychological damage. The development of anti-neural technologies represented another avenue of desperate innovation that pushed the boundaries of Imperial understanding of consciousness and identity. Imperial scientists attempted to create devices that could detect and disrupt Rangdan neural parasites without destroying the host brain, a challenge that required them to map human consciousness at a level of detail that had never been attempted. The most successful anti-neural technology developed during this period was the cogitator Xenocides, a device that could scan brain tissue and identify the electromagnetic signatures associated with Rangdan modification. However, the device's effectiveness required calibration against known infected subjects, and its operation caused severe psychological trauma to the individuals being scanned, including permanent memory loss and personality changes. New methods of warfare developed during this period included the systematic use of psychological torture as a weapon against Rangdan-influenced populations. Imperial forces discovered that extreme psychological stress could sometimes disrupt the symbiotic relationship between Rangdan parasites and their hosts, leading to the development of interrogation and treatment protocols that bordered on systematic sadism. The unintended consequences of these desperate innovations began to manifest almost immediately, as Imperial forces implementing the new weapons and tactics began to display psychological and behavioral changes that mirrored some aspects of Rangdan influence. Personnel involved in anti-Rangdan operations showed increased aggression, decreased empathy, and a willingness to employ extreme measures that suggested a fundamental shift in their moral and ethical frameworks. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that some of the biological weapons developed by Project Terminus showed signs of autonomous evolution, adapting their targeting parameters in response to battlefield conditions in ways that had not been programmed by their creators. These weapons began to target human populations that showed genetic markers associated with resistance to Imperial authority, suggesting that they were developing their own criteria for distinguishing between loyal and disloyal subjects. The point of no return in Imperial policy came with the authorization of the first Rangdan Xenocide protocols in late 920.M30. The decision to implement systematic extermination of entire populations, including human populations that had been contaminated by Rangdan influence, represented a fundamental shift in Imperial philosophy from liberation and unification to preservation of human purity through selective elimination. The Xenocide protocols developed during this period established the precedent for what would later become standard exterminatus doctrine. But their initial implementation was far more sophisticated and targeted than the crude planetary annihilation techniques that would be used in later centuries. The Xenocide weapons were designed to eliminate specific biological signatures while leaving infrastructure and uncontaminated populations intact, requiring a level of precision that pushed Imperial technology to its absolute limits. The authorization of Xenocide protocols required Imperial authorities to redefine fundamental concepts about the value of human life and the acceptable costs of preserving human independence. The decision was justified through philosophical arguments that contaminated humans were no longer truly human, and that their elimination was necessary to preserve the essential nature of humanity for future generations. The psychological impact on Imperial personnel involved in Xenocide operations was severe and immediate. Soldiers and officers who participated in the systematic elimination of human populations, even populations that had been confirmed as contaminated by Rangdan influence, showed high rates of psychological breakdown and required extensive reconditioning to maintain their effectiveness as Imperial forces. The development of reconditioning techniques for personnel involved in Xenocide operations led to innovations in psychological manipulation that would later influence Imperial practices throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. These techniques involved systematic modification of memory and emotional response that enabled Imperial personnel to participate in extreme actions while maintaining their psychological stability and loyalty to Imperial objectives. The innovations implemented during this period established capabilities and precedents that would fundamentally alter the character of Imperial military operations for the remainder of the Great Crusade. The weapons, tactics, and philosophical frameworks developed to fight the Rangdan would be applied to subsequent conflicts with other xenos species and eventually to the suppression of human populations that resisted Imperial authority. The hidden costs of these innovations included the creation of institutional structures within the Imperial military that were specifically designed to conduct operations that violated Imperial principles while maintaining operational security and psychological stability among personnel. These structures would later evolve into the more familiar organs of Imperial oppression, including the early forms of what would become the Commissariat and the various organs of the Inquisition. The crossing of ethical and practical boundaries during the anti-Rangdan campaign created a precedent for abandoning Imperial principles whenever the survival of the Imperium was perceived to be at stake. This precedent would be invoked repeatedly throughout Imperial history, leading to the gradual transformation of the Imperium from a force for human liberation into an instrument of human oppression justified by the necessity of species survival. The desperate innovations of the anti-Rangdan campaign succeeded in their immediate objective of providing Imperial forces with weapons capable of defeating the Rangdan threat. But they did so at a cost that would echo through human history for millennia. The Imperium that emerged from the Rangdan conflicts possessed capabilities that its founders would have found abhorrent, justified by necessities that had transformed the very nature of what it meant to be human in a galaxy where consciousness itself had become a battlefield. The internal threat that emerged within Imperial command structures during 921.M30 represented the culmination of decades of patient Rangdan infiltration, revealing a scope of biological and psychological manipulation that exceeded even the most pessimistic assessments of enemy capabilities. The discovery that the highest levels of Imperial military hierarchy had been compromised forced a confrontation with the terrifying reality that the war against the Rangdan had been fought under conditions of complete strategic transparency, with enemy forces possessing detailed knowledge of every Imperial plan, capability, and weakness. The origins of what Imperial historians would later classify as the Great Betrayal can be traced to the systematic targeting of Imperial command personnel by Rangdan biological agents beginning in the early years of Northern Sector expansion. Unlike the crude infiltration techniques initially observed in frontline troops, the compromise of senior Imperial officers required sophisticated biological modification that preserved their apparent personalities and decision-making capabilities while gradually aligning their strategic priorities with Rangdan objectives. The turning point that exposed the full extent of internal compromise occurred during the Council of Keth in mid-921.m30, when War Master Horus convened a strategic planning session to coordinate the Imperial response to escalating Rangdan activities across multiple sectors. The Council brought together senior commanders from 18 Space Marine legions, Imperial Army leadership, and representatives from key Mechanicum Forge worlds to develop comprehensive countermeasures against the growing threat. The revelation of widespread infiltration came not through sophisticated detection methods, but through a tragic accident during the Council proceedings. A technical malfunction in the chamber's atmospheric systems exposed all attendees to a concentrated burst of anti-Rangdan biological agents that had been developed as part of Project Terminus research. The exposure was intended to be harmless to uncontaminated individuals, serving merely as a precautionary sterilization protocol. The immediate effects of the exposure revealed the horrifying truth about the extent of Rangdan infiltration. Over 40% of the senior Imperial commanders present at the Council began experiencing violent biological reactions as the anti-Rangdan agents attacked the sophisticated parasites that had been governing their decision-making processes for months or years. The affected officers, who had shown no previous signs of compromise, began convulsing as their neural tissue was simultaneously damaged by the weapons designed to free them from alien influence. The spreading corruption through Imperial command structures became apparent as the biological reactions triggered cascade failures in the neural modification systems that had been maintaining the appearance of normal human behavior in compromised officers. As the Rangdan parasites died, their hosts experienced massive neurological trauma that revealed the extent to which their personalities and memories had been artificially maintained by alien biotechnology. Lord Commander Macharius of the Steel Legion, who had been considered one of the most reliable and effective Imperial commanders in the northern sectors, began speaking in languages that linguistic analysis identified as probable Rangdan communication protocols. His speech patterns revealed detailed knowledge of Imperial military capabilities, troop dispositions, and strategic plans that could only have been acquired through systematic intelligence gathering over extended periods. Captain Corbin Severus of the Imperial Fists, whose tactical recommendations had been instrumental in several recent Imperial victories, was discovered to have been providing strategic intelligence to Rangdan forces through biological communication methods that operated below the level of conscious awareness. His genuine belief in his loyalty to the Imperium had been maintained even as his unconscious mind served enemy objectives through mechanisms he could not perceive or control. The final realization of the disaster's scope came with the discovery that the compromised officers retained complete memories of their activities, while under Rangdan influence, creating the paradox of individuals who were simultaneously victims and perpetrators of betrayal. They had genuinely believed they were serving Imperial interests even as they unconsciously implemented strategies that served Rangdan expansion objectives. The psychological impact of these revelations created a crisis of confidence that propagated throughout Imperial command structures, as officers began questioning not only the loyalty of their colleagues, but the authenticity of their own thoughts and motivations. The knowledge that consciousness itself could be modified without the awareness of the affected individual created existential anxiety that interfered with normal decision-making processes and command effectiveness. The most devastating aspect of the betrayal was the discovery that Imperial military doctrine had been systematically modified over the course of the Northern Campaign to better serve Rangdan objectives. Tactical manuals had been revised, training protocols had been adjusted, and strategic planning methods had been altered in ways that appeared to be natural evolution of Imperial military thinking, but actually served to make Imperial forces more predictable and vulnerable to Rangdan countermeasures. The false Primarch crisis emerged during this period as intelligence analysis revealed that several Primarchs had been showing behavioral anomalies that suggested possible Rangdan influence. While no direct evidence of Primarch compromise was ever confirmed, the mere possibility that beings of such fundamental importance to Imperial identity could be affected by Rangdan modification created paranoia that reached the highest levels of Imperial government. The crisis deepened when it was discovered that the Space Marine legions themselves were not immune to Rangdan infiltration. The 11th and 20th legions showed statistical anomalies in their combat performance and strategic decision-making that suggested systematic compromise of their command structures. The discovery that even post-human Space Marines could be affected by Rangdan biological modification shattered assumptions about the inherent superiority of Imperial genetic enhancement. The Great Purge, initiated in response to these discoveries, represented the most comprehensive security operation in Imperial history up to that point, involving the systematic examination of every Imperial officer above the rank of company commander using the newly developed anti-Rangdan detection methods. The Purge revealed that Rangdan infiltration had reached into every aspect of Imperial military operations, including logistics, intelligence, medical services, and communications. The implementation of purge protocols required the execution or forced retirement of over 30% of senior Imperial military leadership, creating a catastrophic disruption in command continuity at the moment when effective leadership was most desperately needed. The replacement of experienced commanders with junior officers who lacked both combat experience and detailed knowledge of anti-Rangdan operations created tactical vulnerabilities that the enemy immediately exploited. The command restructure necessitated by the Purge involved the complete reorganization of Imperial military hierarchy according to new principles designed to prevent future infiltration. These principles included systematic rotation of command personnel, implementation of redundant command structures, and the establishment of internal security protocols that assumed the possibility of compromise at every level of the hierarchy. The philosophical implications of the Great Betrayal forced Imperial authorities to confront fundamental questions about the nature of loyalty, duty, and individual responsibility in contexts where consciousness itself could be manipulated by external forces. The traditional Imperial concepts of personal honor and moral culpability became meaningless when applied to individuals whose choices had been influenced by biological agents beyond their awareness or control. The betrayal's revelation coincided precisely with the activation of the first comprehensive Xenocide protocols, creating a situation where Imperial forces were simultaneously discovering the extent of enemy infiltration and implementing weapons designed to eliminate entire populations based on biological markers. The timing suggested that the Rangdan had planned for this moment, using their knowledge of Imperial psychology to predict and prepare for the massive escalation that would inevitably follow the discovery of their infiltration. The trusted sources that had been compromised included not only military commanders, but also technical specialists, intelligence analysts, and scientific researchers whose work had been fundamental to Imperial understanding of the Rangdan threat. The realization that much of Imperial intelligence about enemy capabilities had been filtered through compromised sources forced a complete reassessment of everything Imperial forces thought they knew about their enemies. The challenge of distinguishing between fundamental beliefs that had been authentically held and those that had been artificially implanted by Rangdan modification created lasting psychological trauma among Imperial personnel that extended far beyond the immediate military crisis. The knowledge that thoughts, emotions, and moral convictions could be artificially induced while feeling completely genuine created an epidemic of existential anxiety that required new forms of psychological treatment and spiritual counseling. The Great Betrayal marked the moment when the Rangdan conflict transformed from a military campaign against external enemies into a war for the preservation of human consciousness itself. The discovery that the enemy had been operating from within Imperial command structures for years revealed that traditional concepts of victory and defeat were inadequate for addressing a threat that attacked the very foundations of individual identity and free will. The systematic breakdown of Imperial command and control systems that followed the revelations of the Great Betrayal created a cascade of failures that threatened to destroy the very foundations of the Great Crusade itself. The infrastructure that had enabled Imperial expansion across the galaxy proved catastrophically vulnerable to the loss of trusted leadership and reliable communication networks, creating opportunities for the Rangdan to exploit Imperial weakness on a scale that exceeded their most optimistic projections. The infrastructure breakdown began with the collapse of secure communication protocols that had been compromised by decades of Rangdan infiltration. The discovery that astropathic networks contain numerous compromised psychers forced Imperial authorities to suspend telepathic communication across wide areas of Imperial space, effectively blinding Imperial command to the activities of their own forces. The alternative communication methods available to Imperial forces proved inadequate for coordinating complex military operations across interstellar distances. The astropathic communication crisis created immediate problems for Imperial forces engaged in anti-Rangdan operations, as tactical coordination between different Imperial units became impossible without reliable information exchange. Space Marine companies found themselves operating in complete isolation, unaware of the activities of other Imperial forces in their operational areas, and unable to coordinate their efforts with supporting elements from the Imperial Army or Mechanicum forces. System failures propagated through Imperial military infrastructure, as the security protocols implemented during the Great Purge revealed additional layers of compromise that had previously gone undetected. Supply chains that had functioned efficiently for decades were discovered to contain multiple points of Rangdan influence, with logistics personnel unconsciously directing resources and equipment to locations that served enemy objectives rather than Imperial military needs. The Mechanicum faced particular challenges during this period, as their cybernetic enhancement made them initially appear immune to biological modification, leading to overconfidence that was shattered when several Forge worlds reported systematic sabotage of critical manufacturing facilities. The discovery that even cybernetic organisms could be influenced by sophisticated Rangdan biotechnology forced a complete reassessment of Mechanicum security protocols and production methods. The retreat from key positions began as Imperial commanders, lacking reliable intelligence about the scope of Rangdan infiltration in their own forces, implemented defensive strategies that prioritized the preservation of uncontaminated personnel over the maintenance of strategic objectives. The systematic withdrawal from forward positions in the northern sectors created a strategic vacuum that Rangdan forces immediately exploited, accelerating their expansion into previously secure Imperial territory. The evacuation of compromised worlds created massive refugee populations that served as vectors for continued Rangdan expansion, as the biological agents responsible for neural modification could remain dormant in affected individuals for extended periods before activation. The refugee crisis overwhelmed Imperial medical facilities and created perfect conditions for the spread of Rangdan influence to previously uncontaminated worlds throughout Imperial space. Unity dissolving into factions became apparent as different Imperial organizations developed incompatible approaches to the Rangdan threat based on their particular vulnerabilities and capabilities. The Space Marine legions, with their enhanced resistance to biological modification, advocated for aggressive direct confrontation with Rangdan forces. The Imperial Army, having suffered higher rates of infiltration, favored defensive strategies focused on containment and population screening. The Mechanicum pursued their own research agenda focused on technological solutions to the Rangdan threat, often refusing to share their findings with other Imperial organizations due to concerns about information security. This lack of coordination between Imperial factions created opportunities for Rangdan forces to exploit the gaps in Imperial response strategies, and prevented the development of comprehensive countermeasures. The crisis in Imperial unity was exacerbated by the philosophical divisions that emerged regarding the acceptable costs of defeating the Rangdan threat. Conservative factions within Imperial leadership argued for limiting anti-Rangdan measures to avoid compromising Imperial principles, while radical factions advocated for the use of any methods necessary to ensure human survival, regardless of their ethical implications. Final attempts at maintaining coordinated Imperial response included the establishment of emergency command protocols that bypassed normal chains of authority and concentrated decision-making power in the hands of individuals who had been confirmed as uncontaminated through the most rigorous testing available. However, these protocols created their own vulnerabilities as the concentration of authority made Imperial operations more predictable and provided Rangdan forces with fewer but more valuable targets for infiltration efforts. The preparation for comprehensive Xenocide operations required the mobilization of resources and capabilities that had never been deployed simultaneously in Imperial history. The logistics of coordinating world-killing weapons across multiple star systems while maintaining operational security against an enemy that had demonstrated the ability to infiltrate Imperial command structures, created challenges that pushed Imperial organizational capabilities beyond their breaking points. The mobilization of world-killing assets revealed the extent to which Imperial military doctrine had been unprepared for conflicts that required the complete destruction of inhabited worlds. The Great Crusade had been designed for conquest and integration, not extermination, and the weapons and tactics needed for systematic xenocide had to be developed and deployed under extreme time pressure, while Imperial forces were simultaneously engaged in defensive operations. The timeline of collapse accelerated dramatically throughout 922.M30, as each attempt to implement security measures revealed additional layers of compromise that had previously escaped detection. The discovery that Rangdan infiltration had reached into the highest levels of Imperial government, including the personal staffs of several Primarchs, created a crisis of confidence that threatened to paralyze Imperial decision-making entirely. The authorization of the first Rangdan Xenocide in late 922. Met 30 represented both the nadir of Imperial military effectiveness and the beginning of their recovery, as the decision to implement systematic extermination of contaminated populations finally provided Imperial forces with clear objectives that could not be compromised by enemy infiltration. The Xenocide protocols offered the grim advantage of requiring no complex coordination or subtle tactical thinking that could be subverted by compromised personnel. The implementation of Xenocide operations required Imperial forces to abandon every principle of proportional response and discriminate targeting that had guided Imperial military operations since the beginning of the Great Crusade. The decision to destroy entire worlds based on the possibility of biological contamination established precedents that would influence Imperial policy for millennia, creating institutional capabilities for systematic extermination that would later be applied to other perceived threats to Imperial security. The psychological cost of implementing Xenocide protocols on Imperial personnel was severe and immediate, as soldiers and officers who had joined the Great Crusade to unite humanity found themselves systematically destroying human populations that might have been saved through other methods. The cognitive dissonance created by these operations required extensive psychological conditioning and ideological reinforcement to maintain the effectiveness of Imperial forces. The cascading effects of the security purges created a self-reinforcing cycle of paranoia and suspicion that made normal military operations increasingly difficult as personnel at every level began to question the loyalty and authenticity of their colleagues and superiors. The atmosphere of mistrust that pervaded Imperial forces during this period created exactly the conditions of psychological stress that made personnel more susceptible to Rangdan influence, perpetuating the very problem the purges were intended to solve. The rapid loss of experienced leadership through purges and security measures left Imperial forces in the hands of junior officers who lacked both the combat experience and the institutional knowledge necessary to conduct complex anti-Rangdan operations effectively. The learning curve required for new commanders to understand the unique challenges posed by the Rangdan threat created tactical vulnerabilities that enemy forces exploited ruthlessly. The survivors of the Great Purge faced choices that would determine not just the immediate outcome of the Rangdan conflict, but the fundamental character of Imperial civilization for millennia to come. The decision to prioritize species survival over individual rights and ethical principles created institutional structures and philosophical frameworks that would later justify forms of oppression and control that the founders of the Great Crusade would have found abhorrent. The fate-determining choice that emerged from the cascading collapse was whether to preserve Imperial principles and risk human extinction, or abandon those principles and risk losing the essential humanity they were meant to protect. The decision to choose survival over virtue established precedents that would echo through Imperial history, creating justifications for increasingly extreme measures whenever the survival of the Imperium was perceived to be at stake. The cascading collapse of Imperial command and control systems during this period revealed the fundamental vulnerability of centralized authority to systematic infiltration and subversion. The lessons learned from this crisis would later influence the development of more resilient, but also more oppressive forms of Imperial government that prioritize security over efficiency and control over innovation, shaping the authoritarian character of Imperial civilization for the remainder of its history. The build-up to the final confrontation that would determine the fate of both human and Rangdan civilizations began with the Emperor's personal decision to assume direct command of anti-Rangdan operations in early 923.M30. This unprecedented intervention marked the first time since the Unification Wars that the Master of Mankind had taken personal control of military operations, signaling to all Imperial forces that the Rangdan threat represented an existential crisis that required the full application of Imperial capabilities regardless of cost or consequence. The mobilization for what would become known as the First Rangdan Xenocide required the concentration of military assets on a scale that exceeded even the largest campaigns of the Great Crusade. Over half of the active Space Marine legions were redeployed to the northern sectors, supported by Imperial army formations numbering in the hundreds of millions and a Mechanicum warfleet that included some of the most powerful vessels ever constructed by human civilization. The Emperor's strategic assessment of the Rangdan threat concluded that conventional military victory was impossible, as long as any Rangdan organisms remained capable of biological reproduction and adaptation. The enemy's demonstrated ability to infiltrate and corrupt Imperial forces meant that any victory that left Rangdan remnants intact would eventually result in renewed infiltration and the gradual transformation of humanity into an extension of alien collective consciousness. The systematic extermination campaign that followed represented a fundamental departure from every previous Imperial military operation. Rather than seeking to conquer and integrate Rangdan territories, Imperial forces were tasked with the complete biological sterilization of every world that showed evidence of Rangdan contamination. This mission required the deployment of weapons and tactics that had been specifically designed to eliminate all forms of life rather than preserve valuable resources or populations. The detailed account of the first Xenocide reveals the industrial scale of destruction that Imperial forces were capable of implementing when unconstrained by considerations of proportionality or discrimination. The campaign began with the simultaneous bombardment of 47 confirmed Rangdan worlds using cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombs, and atmospheric incinerators that reduced entire biospheres to sterile ash within hours of deployment. The Rangdan response to this escalation demonstrated capabilities that had been held in reserve throughout the previous phases of the conflict. Entire Imperial fleets found themselves under attack by weapons that defied conventional understanding of physics and biology, including what appeared to be living spacecraft that could adapt their configuration in real time to counter Imperial tactical responses. Key turning points in the conflict occurred when Imperial forces discovered that the Rangdan possessed strategic weapons comparable to Imperial exterminatus capabilities, including the ability to trigger stellar instabilities that could destroy entire solar systems. The realization that the enemy could eliminate Imperial worlds as easily as Imperial forces could destroy Rangdan territories created a mutual destruction scenario that forced both sides to develop increasingly extreme measures to achieve decisive victory. The climactic battle of the First Xenocide took place in the Advex Mors system, where Rangdan forces had concentrated their remaining military assets for a final defensive stand. The engagement lasted for over 6 months and involved fleet actions on a scale that would not be equaled until the Solar War at the climax of the Horus Heresy. The battle's outcome hinged on the Emperor's personal duel with what Imperial records describe only as the Slath King, a Rangdan entity that appeared to serve as the focal point of their collective intelligence. The Emperor's personal combat capabilities, rarely displayed during the Great Crusade, proved decisive in breaking Rangdan resistance. Contemporary accounts describe reality itself bending around the Master of Mankind as he engaged enemy forces that operated according to principles that violated natural law. The destruction of the Sloth King created cascade failures throughout the Rangdan collective that left their remaining forces vulnerable to conventional Imperial assault. The strategic evolution across the 3 separate Xenocides that would follow demonstrated the Imperium's growing expertise in conducting wars of extermination. Each subsequent campaign incorporated lessons learned from previous operations, developing increasingly efficient methods for identifying and eliminating biological contamination while minimizing Imperial casualties and resource expenditure. The second Rangdan Xenocide, conducted between 956.M30 and 960.M30, focused on the systematic elimination of Rangdan remnants that had survived the first campaign by adopting dormant or highly dispersed survival strategies. This campaign required the development of new detection methods capable of identifying individual Rangdan organisms that had integrated themselves into apparently normal ecosystems across hundreds of worlds. The Emperor's direct participation in the Second Xenocide established protocols for the use of his personal capabilities in situations where conventional Imperial forces proved inadequate. The campaign saw the first deployment of what Imperial records cryptically refer to as ontological weapons, devices or techniques that operated by altering the fundamental nature of reality rather than applying conventional force. The third and final Rangdan Xenocide, conducted between 967.M30 and 970.M30, represented the culmination of Imperial expertise in biological warfare and systematic extermination. This campaign achieved complete success in eliminating all traces of Rangdan biology from Imperial space, but at costs that included the complete destruction of 2 Space Marine legions and the implementation of security measures that would permanently alter the character of Imperial civilization. The destruction of the Lost Legions during the final Xenocide operations remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in Imperial history. Contemporary evidence suggests that the 2nd and 11th Legions were eliminated not by enemy action, but by Imperial command when it was discovered that their gene seed had been compromised by Rangdan biological agents in ways that could not be reversed or contained. The decision to destroy 2 entire Space Marine legions represented the ultimate expression of the philosophy that had guided Imperial anti-Rangdan operations from their inception: that any degree of contamination or compromise was unacceptable when the essential nature of humanity was at stake. The psychological impact of this decision on the surviving Primarchs and legions created lasting trauma that would influence their behavior throughout the remainder of the Great Crusade. The immediate aftermath of the Third Xenocide saw the implementation of the most comprehensive information control operation in Imperial history, as all records relating to the Rangdan conflicts were classified at the highest levels and removed from general circulation. The official history of the Great Crusade was revised to eliminate any reference to the Xenocides, creating the fiction that Imperial expansion had proceeded without major setbacks or moral compromises. The victory celebration that marked the end of the Rangdan threat was notably subdued compared to other Imperial triumphs, reflecting the recognition among Imperial leadership that their success had been achieved through methods that violated the fundamental principles they claimed to uphold. The preservation of human independence had required the adoption of techniques that made Imperial civilization less recognizably human in its values and priorities. The final moments of the Third Xenocide created precedents and established capabilities that would echo through Imperial history for millennia to come. The institutional structures developed for conducting systematic extermination, the philosophical frameworks that justified extreme measures in the name of species survival, and the technological capabilities for biological warfare would all find applications in subsequent Imperial conflicts against other perceived threats to human purity and independence. The Emperor's personal involvement in the Xenocide operations left him fundamentally changed in ways that would influence his subsequent behavior throughout the remainder of the Great Crusade and beyond. Witnesses to his participation in anti-Rangdan operations reported that the Master of Mankind displayed capabilities and employed methods that seemed to draw upon sources of power that exceeded even his already legendary abilities, suggesting that victory over the Rangdan had required him to access aspects of his nature that were normally held in restraint. The confusion and disorder that pervaded Imperial space following the conclusion of the Third Rangdan Xenocide in 970 Meng 30 reflected the magnitude of the institutional and psychological trauma inflicted by 3 decades of warfare that had challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Imperial civilization. The victory over the Rangdan, while complete in its elimination of the alien threat, had been achieved at costs that created new forms of instability threatening to undermine the very foundations of the Great Crusade. The immediate period following the Xenocides was characterized by a crisis of identity within Imperial institutions as personnel at every level struggled to reconcile their understanding of Imperial values with the methods that had been employed to achieve victory. The systematic extermination of entire worlds, the destruction of 2 Space Marine legions, and the implementation of security measures that assumed treachery at every level of Imperial hierarchy had created an organization that bore little resemblance to the force for human liberation that had begun the Great Crusade. How different Imperial groups attempted to cope with the trauma of the Xenocide operations varied dramatically based on their level of involvement and access to information about what had actually occurred. Space Marine legions that had participated directly in the extermination campaigns showed high rates of psychological casualties and required extensive reconditioning to maintain their effectiveness as Imperial military forces. The Imperial army formations that had been involved in anti-Rangdan operations faced particular challenges in adapting to conventional military operations after years of warfare that had required the systematic destruction of human populations. Many veteran soldiers found themselves unable to function in situations that required discrimination between enemy combatants and civilian populations, having been conditioned to view any potentially contaminated human as a legitimate target for elimination. The Mechanicum experienced a crisis of doctrine as their involvement in developing biological weapons for the Xenocide campaigns forced them to confront the implications of their pursuit of knowledge regardless of ethical considerations. Several Forge Worlds implemented radical reforms of their research protocols in an attempt to prevent future participation in projects that violated their understanding of the machine god's will. The struggle to fill the power vacuum created by the massive casualties and institutional disruption of the Xenocide period led to the promotion of junior personnel who lacked the experience and institutional knowledge necessary to maintain Imperial operational effectiveness. This created a learning deficit that would take decades to address and contributed to the slower pace of expansion that characterized the later phases of the Great Crusade. The unexpected consequences of victory began to manifest almost immediately as Imperial forces discovered that the capabilities they had developed for fighting the Rangdan had applications against other perceived threats to Imperial security. The biological weapons, surveillance techniques, and extermination protocols that had been created for use against alien enemies proved equally effective against human populations that resisted Imperial authority or showed signs of genetic deviation from accepted norms. The new dangers that emerged during the transition period included the rise of internal security organizations that had been granted extraordinary powers during the emergency conditions of the Xenocide campaigns and proved reluctant to surrender those powers once the immediate threat had passed. These organizations began applying anti-Rangdan security protocols to other perceived threats, creating a surveillance and control apparatus that fundamentally altered the relationship between Imperial authorities and Imperial citizens. The implementation of the Great Silence protocols represented the most comprehensive information control operation in human history as Imperial authorities sought to eliminate all knowledge of the Rangdan conflicts from public consciousness. This operation required the systematic alteration or destruction of millions of documents, the reconditioning of thousands of personnel who had participated in the campaigns, and the creation of fictional historical narratives to explain the gaps created by the censorship. The psychological conditioning required to implement the Great Silence created new forms of trauma as Imperial personnel were forced to suppress or modify their memories of events that had fundamentally shaped their understanding of their own identities and values. Many individuals who underwent the conditioning process experienced lasting psychological damage that manifested as depression, anxiety, and difficulty forming meaningful relationships with other human beings. The reconstruction efforts undertaken during this period focused primarily on restoring Imperial military capabilities rather than addressing the institutional and ethical damage caused by the Xenocide campaigns. This priority reflected the recognition among Imperial leadership that the methods employed against the Rangdan had established precedents that might be required again if similar threats emerged in the future. The reorganization of surviving Space Marine legions involved not only the redistribution of personnel and resources, but also the systematic revision of legion histories and traditions to eliminate references to the destroyed legions and their participation in the Xenocide operations. This process required the creation of new mythologies and cultural practices that could provide psychological continuity while concealing the traumatic reality of what had been lost. The development of new security protocols incorporated lessons learned from the Rangdan infiltration, while attempting to balance the need for vigilance against the risk of creating paranoid institutional cultures that would interfere with normal Imperial operations. These protocols established the foundation for the surveillance and control systems that would later characterize Imperial governance, but their initial implementation was more moderate than what would develop in subsequent centuries. The resumption of Great Crusade expansion operations in the mid-970s of the 30th millennium proceeded at a significantly slower pace than had characterized the pre-Rangdan period. This deceleration reflected both the practical challenges of rebuilding Imperial military capabilities and the psychological reluctance of Imperial forces to engage in the kind of rapid expansion that had created the conditions for Rangdan infiltration. The discovery of new threats that had emerged during the Imperial focus on the Rangdan conflict created additional challenges for reconstruction efforts. Several alien civilizations had used the Imperial distraction to strengthen their own positions, requiring renewed military campaigns that drew resources away from institutional recovery and force reconstitution. The emergence of what would later be recognized as early chaos influences began during this period, as the psychological trauma and ethical compromises of the Xenocide campaigns created vulnerabilities that malevolent entities could exploit. The systematic violation of Imperial principles and the destruction of institutional safeguards that had occurred during the anti-Rangdan operations created pathways for corruption that would not become apparent until the Horus Heresy revealed their full extent. The veterans of the Xenocide campaigns proved particularly susceptible to these emerging influences, as their experience of necessary evil in service of human survival created philosophical frameworks that could be exploited by entities that promised power without moral constraints. The subsequent corruption of several prominent Imperial commanders who had distinguished themselves during the Rangdan conflicts established patterns that would recur throughout Imperial history. The institutional memory of the Xenocide operations, while officially suppressed, continued to influence Imperial policy and military doctrine in subtle ways that would shape the development of Imperial civilization for millennia. The acceptance of extreme measures in the name of species survival, the prioritization of security over individual rights, and the assumption that threats to human purity justified any response had become embedded in Imperial institutional culture even as knowledge of their origins was erased. The consequences of the Xenocides extended beyond the immediate participants to influence the entire trajectory of human development, creating philosophical and institutional frameworks that would eventually transform the Imperium from a force for human liberation into an instrument of human oppression. The victory over the Rangdan had preserved human independence at the cost of human freedom, establishing precedents that would echo through the grim darkness of the far future. The period immediately following the Third Xenocide represented both the nadir and the turning point of Imperial moral development, as the organization that had begun the Great Crusade with noble intentions completed its transformation into something that prioritized survival over virtue and control over liberation. The seeds of the dystopian civilization that would characterize the 41st millennium had been planted in the ashes of the Rangdan worlds, germinating in the institutional trauma of victory achieved through systematic violation of every principle that had once made that victory worth pursuing. The technological legacy of the Rangdan Xenocides continued to influence Imperial military doctrine and capability development for millennia, after the conclusion of the conflicts themselves, establishing precedents and creating institutional capabilities that would fundamentally alter the character of Imperial civilization. The biological weapons, surveillance technologies, and extermination protocols developed during the anti-Rangdan campaigns became integral components of Imperial military doctrine, applied not only to subsequent xenos threats, but increasingly to human populations that deviated from Imperial orthodoxy. The normalization of exterminatus doctrine represented perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the Xenocide operations, transforming what had initially been an emergency measure of last resort into a standard tool of Imperial policy. The technological infrastructure developed for systematically sterilizing Rangdan-contaminated worlds provided the foundation for the planet-killing capabilities that would later be employed against countless human and alien civilizations throughout Imperial history. The philosophical framework that justified the destruction of entire worlds to prevent biological contamination evolved into broader justifications for extreme measures against any perceived threat to Imperial security or doctrinal purity. The precedent established by the decision to eliminate 2 Space Marine legions rather than risk contamination created institutional acceptance of the principle that no individual or organization was too valuable to sacrifice in the name of species survival. The cultural impact of the Xenocides manifested most clearly in the dramatic shift in Imperial attitudes toward alien life, and the concept of biological purity that occurred during the post-Xenocide period, where early Great Crusade policy had sometimes permitted the integration of useful xenos species into Imperial civilization. The Rangdan experience created an absolute prohibition against any form of alien integration based on the demonstrated risks of biological contamination and consciousness modification. This cultural transformation extended beyond official policy to influence the psychological development of Imperial personnel at every level. The knowledge that alien intelligence could operate through subtle biological manipulation created a permanent state of paranoia regarding any form of contact with non-human life forms, leading to the development of increasingly extreme measures for preventing and detecting alien influence. The intensified obsession with genetic purity that characterized post-Xenocide Imperial policy reflected the traumatic recognition that human biology itself could be weaponized by sufficiently advanced alien intelligence. The comprehensive genetic screening protocols developed during the anti-Rangdan campaigns became standard practice throughout Imperial space, creating institutional capabilities for identifying and eliminating genetic deviations that were later applied to purely human variations. The ongoing conflicts created by the Xenocide experience included not only continued military campaigns against suspected Rangdan remnants, but also internal conflicts within Imperial institutions regarding the appropriate application of anti-Rangdan measures to other perceived threats. The institutional structures created for conducting systematic extermination developed their own bureaucratic momentum, seeking new applications for their capabilities even after the original threat had been eliminated. The permanent establishment of internal security organizations, with extraordinary powers to investigate and eliminate suspected contamination, created ongoing tensions between operational effectiveness and individual rights that would characterize Imperial governance for millennia. These organizations, originally created for the specific purpose of combating Rangdan infiltration, evolved into general-purpose instruments of political control that applied Xenocide-era security measures to an ever-expanding range of perceived threats. Hidden survivors and remnants of the Rangdan conflicts continued to influence Imperial development through several mechanisms that were not immediately apparent to Imperial authorities. The institutional trauma experienced by veterans of the Xenocide campaigns created psychological vulnerabilities that were later exploited by Chaos entities, establishing pathways for corruption that would prove decisive during the Horus Heresy. More directly, the biological research conducted during the anti-Rangdan campaigns had created repositories of genetic material and biological weapons that posed ongoing risks of accidental or deliberate release. Several incidents during the later phases of the Great Crusade involved the escape or misuse of Rangdan-derived biotechnology, creating localized outbreaks that required the application of Xenocide protocols to Imperial worlds that had never been directly threatened by the original Rangdan expansion. The technological developments that had emerged from Imperial research into Rangdan biology found applications in legitimate Imperial biotechnology, contributing to advances in space marine gene seed enhancement, medical treatment, and agricultural development. However, this beneficial legacy was accompanied by ongoing risks as the manipulation of biological systems on the scale required for anti-Rangdan weapons created capabilities that could be turned against human populations with devastating effectiveness. The doctrinal changes implemented in response to the Rangdan threat fundamentally altered Imperial military thinking regarding the nature of warfare and the acceptable costs of victory. The recognition that consciousness itself could be a battlefield led to the development of psychological warfare techniques and mind control technologies that would later be applied to Imperial populations as well as enemy forces. The command paranoia that had developed during the Great Betrayal became institutionalized in Imperial military doctrine through the establishment of redundant command structures, systematic rotation of personnel assignments, and comprehensive surveillance of Imperial officers at every level. While these measures provided some protection against future infiltration attempts, they also created an atmosphere of mistrust that interfered with normal military cooperation and reduced overall Imperial effectiveness. Neural security protocols developed to detect and counter Rangdan biological modification evolved into general-purpose surveillance technologies that monitored the thoughts and loyalties of Imperial personnel on a continuous basis. The normalization of invasive psychological monitoring created precedents for the systematic violation of individual privacy that would later characterize Imperial governance throughout the galaxy. The defense capabilities developed specifically for combating biological warfare found applications in protecting Imperial populations from other forms of contamination, including exposure to chaos influence and various forms of alien pathogen. However, the same technologies that provided protection also enabled unprecedented control over human biology and behavior, creating tools for oppression that exceeded anything available to previous human civilizations. The influence of Xenocide-era developments on Imperial law and governance extended far beyond military applications to reshape fundamental concepts of citizenship, individual rights, and governmental authority. The emergency powers granted to Imperial authorities during the Rangdan crisis established precedents for the suspension of normal legal protections whenever the survival of the Imperium was perceived to be at stake. The legal frameworks developed for prosecuting personnel who had been compromised by Rangdan influence created new categories of crime and punishment that blurred the boundaries between victim and perpetrator. The concept of involuntary treason betrayal committed without conscious awareness due to external manipulation required the development of new forms of justice that prioritized collective security over individual culpability. The administrative structures created for managing the Great Silence and other information control operations evolved into comprehensive censorship and propaganda systems that shaped imperial culture and education for millennia. The techniques developed for modifying memory and suppressing knowledge found applications in controlling public opinion and managing social development according to imperial policy objectives. The economic consequences of the Xenocides included both the enormous costs of conducting 3 separate wars of extermination and the long-term benefits of eliminating a threat that could have consumed the entire Imperium. The resources devoted to anti-Rangdan operations represented the largest single military expenditure in Imperial history, up to that point, requiring the development of new forms of economic mobilization and resource allocation that would later be applied to other major Imperial projects. The industrial capabilities developed for producing biological weapons and planet-killing munitions created new forms of manufacturing technology that found peaceful applications in medicine, agriculture, and environmental management. However, the same industrial infrastructure also created unprecedented capabilities for destruction that made subsequent Imperial military operations far more devastating in their impact on both enemy and civilian populations. The demographic impact of the Xenocides extended beyond the immediate casualties to influence patterns of Imperial expansion and settlement for centuries. The psychological trauma experienced by survivors of Xenocide operations created reluctance to settle in frontier regions where similar threats might emerge, leading to more cautious and heavily defended expansion patterns that slowed the overall pace of Imperial growth. The genetic bottlenecks created by the systematic elimination of potentially contaminated populations had lasting effects on human genetic diversity within Imperial space. While these measures successfully eliminated Rangdan biological agents, they also reduced the overall genetic variability of human populations in ways that increased susceptibility to other forms of biological warfare and reduced the adaptive potential of human civilization. The influence of the Xenocides on Imperial religious and philosophical development was profound and lasting, as the traumatic experience of fighting an enemy that attacked consciousness itself forced the development of new theological frameworks for understanding the nature of human identity and spiritual survival. The Imperial cult that would later dominate Imperial religious life incorporated many elements that had emerged from the Xenocide experience, including the emphasis on absolute loyalty, the fear of contamination, and the acceptance of extreme sacrifice in the name of collective survival. The precedents established by the Emperor's personal participation in the Xenocide operations influenced expectations regarding his future involvement in Imperial military affairs, creating pressure for his direct intervention and subsequent crises, while simultaneously demonstrating the enormous costs associated with deploying his personal capabilities in conventional warfare. The physical and psychological toll of the Xenocides on the Emperor himself contributed to his subsequent withdrawal from direct military command and his focus on the Webway project. The long-term consequences of the Rangdan Xenocides ultimately extended far beyond their immediate military objectives to reshape every aspect of Imperial civilization, creating the institutional structures, cultural attitudes, and technological capabilities that would define the Imperium throughout its subsequent history. The victory over the Rangdan had preserved human independence, but at the cost of transforming humanity into something that might have been unrecognizable to the species the Emperor had originally sought to protect and unite. The modern discoveries that continue to emerge from archaeological investigations of former Rangdan territories suggest that Imperial understanding of the Xenocide campaigns may have been incomplete in ways that carry profound implications for the current state of the galaxy. Recent expeditions to worlds that were subjected to Imperial sterilization protocols during the 30th millennium have uncovered evidence of biological preservation systems that enabled some Rangdan organisms to survive the extermination campaigns in dormant states that could potentially be reactivated under specific environmental conditions. The most disturbing of these discoveries occurred during the exploration of the former Advex Moor system in late Mem 41, when an Adeptus Mechanicus archaeological team detected complex biological signatures beneath the supposedly sterile surface of the world that had served as the primary focus of first Xenocide operations. Deep core sampling revealed the presence of what appeared to be intact Rangdan genetic material preserved in crystalline matrices that had protected it from the sterilization bombardment that had eliminated all other life on the planet. Analysis of the preserved material using advanced Imperial biotechnology revealed that the Rangdan had anticipated the possibility of systematic extermination and had developed biological time capsules designed to preserve their genetic heritage through extended periods of dormancy. These preservation systems incorporated self-repair mechanisms and environmental monitoring capabilities that could trigger reactivation when conditions became favorable for Rangdan expansion. How the Xenocides continue to affect current 41st millennium conflicts becomes apparent when examining the institutional structures and military doctrines that emerged from the anti-Rangdan campaigns and continue to shape Imperial responses to contemporary threats. The exterminatus protocols that were normalized during the Xenocide period have been applied to hundreds of worlds threatened by chaos corruption, tyrannid infestation, and other forms of contamination that echo the original Rangdan threat. The systematic surveillance and genetic screening procedures developed during the Great Silence continue to operate throughout Imperial space, now administered by the various organs of the Inquisition and other Imperial security organizations. These procedures have been expanded to detect not only biological contamination but also psychic corruption, genetic deviation, and ideological heresy, creating a comprehensive control system that monitors every aspect of human life within the Imperium. The tyrannid invasions that began in the late 41st millennium have been interpreted by many Imperial scholars as representing a threat comparable to the original Rangdan expansion, exhibiting similar capabilities for biological manipulation and adaptive evolution that challenge Imperial understanding of the boundaries between individual organisms and collective intelligence. The Imperial response to the tyrannid threat has drawn heavily upon tactics and technologies developed during the Rangdan conflicts, including the use of biological weapons and systematic sterilization protocols. The connections to ongoing 40K narratives extend beyond immediate military applications to influence fundamental aspects of Imperial culture and governance that continue to shape human civilization in the current era. The paranoia and suspicion that characterized Imperial institutions following the Great Betrayal have evolved into permanent features of Imperial political culture, creating systems of internal surveillance and control that assume treachery and corruption at every level of Imperial hierarchy. The Space Marine chapters that trace their lineage to legions that participated in the Xenocide campaigns continue to exhibit cultural characteristics that reflect their ancestors' traumatic experiences, including obsessive attention to genetic purity, extreme hostility toward alien lifeforms, and willingness to employ devastating tactics against any perceived threat to Imperial security. The Adeptus Mechanicus retains institutional memory of the biological warfare research conducted during the anti-Rangdan campaigns, though much of this knowledge has been classified at the highest levels and is accessible only to the most senior tech priests. Recent developments in Imperial biotechnology suggest that some Forge worlds have continued to develop applications of Rangdan-derived research, creating new forms of biological enhancement and control that extend the legacy of the Xenocide operations into the current millennium. The significance of the Xenocides in current Imperial politics becomes apparent when examining the justifications used for extreme Imperial policies and the precedents cited for authoritarian measures that violate traditional concepts of individual rights and human dignity. The institutional acceptance of systematic extermination, genetic manipulation, and mind control that emerged from the anti-Rangdan campaigns continues to provide legal and philosophical foundations for Imperial governance in the 41st millennium. The role of the Xenocides in shaping current Imperial military doctrine extends beyond specific tactics and technologies to influence fundamental strategic thinking about the nature of warfare and the acceptable costs of victory. The recognition that consciousness itself can be a battlefield has led to the development of psychological warfare capabilities and reality manipulation technologies that exceed anything available during the original conflicts. How the Xenocides continue to shape daily life across the galaxy manifests in the genetic screening procedures that determine individual opportunities for advancement within Imperial society, the biological purity standards that govern marriage and reproduction, and the surveillance systems that monitor thoughts and loyalties on a continuous basis. The institutional structures created for combating Rangdan infiltration have evolved into comprehensive control systems that regulate every aspect of human existence within Imperial space. The ongoing influence on current events includes the interpretation of emerging threats through frameworks developed during the Xenocide campaigns, and the application of anti-Rangdan countermeasures to contemporary challenges that may or may not be analogous to the original threat. The institutional momentum of organizations created for combating biological warfare has led to the identification of new forms of contamination and the development of increasingly extreme countermeasures that extend Xenocide-era policies to ever broader categories of perceived threat. Why understanding the Xenocides matters for contemporary imperial policy becomes clear when examining the origins of current imperial institutions and the historical precedents that continue to justify extreme measures in the name of species survival. The philosophical frameworks that emerged from the anti-Rangdan campaigns continue to shape imperial decision-making regarding genetic enhancement, alien contact, and internal security in ways that carry profound implications for the future of human civilization. The archaeological evidence suggesting possible Rangdan survival has created new urgency around questions of imperial preparedness for biological warfare and the adequacy of current screening procedures for detecting alien influence. Recent incidents involving suspected biological contamination have led to the implementation of enhanced security measures that draw directly upon Xenocide-era protocols, demonstrating the continuing relevance of these historical experiences to contemporary imperial challenges. Future developments and possibilities emerging from Xenocide research include the potential for developing enhanced biological weapons based on preserved Rangdan genetic material, the possibility of creating improved detection systems for alien influence, and the risk of accidental reactivation of dormant Rangdan organisms through archaeological activities or environmental changes. The implications for the galaxy's future become apparent when considering the precedents established by the Xenocide campaigns and their potential application to emerging threats that may require similar extreme measures. The institutional capabilities and philosophical frameworks created for combating the Rangdan remain available for deployment against other perceived existential threats, creating the potential for future campaigns of systematic extermination justified by the precedent of species survival. How the Xenocides connect to larger 40K themes of sacrifice, corruption, and the price of survival provides insight into the fundamental trajectory of human civilization within the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The transformation of the Imperium from a force for human liberation into an instrument of human oppression can be traced directly to the institutional and cultural changes that emerged from the anti-Rangdan campaigns, demonstrating how the greatest victories can contain the seeds of ultimate defeat. The final thoughts on cosmic significance reveal that the Rangdan Xenocides represent both humanity's greatest military triumph and its most profound moral failure, establishing the precedents and creating the capabilities that would eventually transform the Imperium into the dystopian civilization of the 41st millennium. The victory over the Rangdan preserved human independence at the cost of human freedom, creating the grim darkness of the far future through the very measures intended to prevent it. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the Rangdan Xenocides stand as humanity's forgotten victory and its most terrible precedent, demonstrating that survival and virtue are not always compatible goals, and that the greatest threats to human civilization may come not from alien enemies, but from the measures taken to defeat them. The wars that saved the Great Crusade also taught the Imperium that sometimes the price of victory is the loss of everything that made victory worth pursuing, creating a legacy that continues to shape human destiny 10,000 years after the last Rangdan organism was believed destroyed. The cosmic implications extend beyond the immediate historical significance to reveal fundamental truths about the nature of civilization, consciousness, and survival in a universe where the greatest threats operate not through conquest but through transformation. The Rangdan understood that the most effective way to defeat an enemy is not to destroy them, but to make them into extensions of your own will while preserving the illusion of their independence. The irony of Imperial victory over the Rangdan is that in defeating this threat, humanity adopted similar methods of control and transformation, ultimately becoming what they had fought to prevent: a civilization that preserved the appearance of human independence while serving objectives that individual humans would never consciously choose to pursue. The Rangdan Xenocides thus represent not just a historical event, but a warning about the paths that civilizations may take when faced with existential threats, demonstrating that the preservation of biological survival may come at the cost of spiritual and cultural death. In the endless war of the 41st millennium, where humanity fights desperately to preserve its existence against countless threats, the shadow of the Rangdan continues to influence every decision, every sacrifice, and every compromise that brings the Imperium closer to victory and further from the ideals that once made victory meaningful.